The images march by one, presenting distinct scenes to the viewer. There is variety in the chosen subjects, landscapes and portraits, large vistas and close-ups, cities and wildlife. It's difficult to fault the aims and ambitions of the photographer. The photography itself is competent. There is a symmetry to many of them, they balance foreground and background, and the lighting is clean. Technically, they're adequate, at the very least. Yet, there's something missing. There's a relentlessness to these images. They're joyless and devoid of emotion. A few have hints of majesty, but many are just scenes, things, places, all presented to the viewer with no frills or gloss. The photos depict the world as it is, not as we'd like it to be. This is the photography of Thomas Sowell. Dry, unpalatable, relentless. After all, life is tough, and I'm just here to tell you the facts. Oh, you can do well, so long as you get real, work hard, and above all be grateful that you live in the greatest country in the world. Thomas Sowell is a man who has lived the American dream. And I don't mean the glib, glitzy version. I mean the gritty, jarring version. Born into poverty in the Jim Crow South during the Great Depression, Sowell was orphaned by the time he was a few years old. He was raised by his aunt and didn't know he was an orphan until he was older. When he was 8, they relocated to Harlem in New York. Though Sowell seemed to do well at school, he had to drop out when he was 16. Not long after this, he left home and lived in a shelter where he kept a knife under his pillow for protection. He took several menial jobs and at one point had to be lent money for food by his boss. It was only in Sowell's late 20s that he obtained his first bachelor's degree. He would go on to excel and receive numerous scholarships, eventually completing his PhD at the University of Chicago under the famous economists George Stigler and Milton Friedman. Sowell was a Marxist for a long time and he specialized in the history of economic thought. But it would not be long before he abandoned his radical leftism and turned to a libertarian form of conservatism. Sowell himself has reflected on the lasting impact these early experiences had on his worldview. In retrospect, even my misfortunes were in some ways fortunate, for they taught me things that would be hard to understand otherwise, and they presented reality from an angle not given to those, among intellectuals especially, whose careers have followed a more straight-line path in familiar grooves. I have lived through experiences which they can only theorize about.
You grew up in Harlem, dropped out of high school to join the Marine Corps during the Korean War, received an undergraduate degree from Harvard, a master's from Columbia, and your doctorate from the University of Chicago. All of which pales by comparison with the fact that you once tried out for the Brooklyn Dodgers.
Oh, how the rest of us love it when Americans randomly reference sports teams we've never heard of. Professor Sowell, you fumbled that answer so hard it's like you're playing for the Seattle Sleepers. Sowell's School of Hard Knocks perspective runs through his economics, and once you understand this, a lot of things fall into place. In this video, we are going to talk mainly about labour markets. Labour markets concern people and how we get by, so they are worth more time than other markets, as Sowell himself acknowledges. This will take us through issues as varied as social mobility, inequality, the minimum wage, immigration, and discrimination. Sowell's attitude towards these things is decidedly in line with American conservatism and the School of Hard Knocks. He believes in the American dream, but he also believes that reality is harsh. To make it, you have to buckle up and work. Them's the breaks.
What about mean-spirited? Conservatives are mean-spirited. They're bigots. They don't like people.
Well, you know, one of the things I tell people say, you know, you're a very tough person. I'm not tough. Life is tough. I'm merely trying to acquaint you with those facts. I'm not tough. Life is tough. I'm merely trying to acquaint you with those facts. Life is tough. I'm merely trying to acquaint you. Life is tough. Life is tough. Life is tough.
I do believe that America is the greatest country in the world, sir. In my first video on Thomas Sowell, we managed part 1 and part 2 of his magnum opus, Basic Economics, which included the definition of the subject, the role of scarcity, the role of markets and prices in allocating that scarcity, the limits of markets, and the proper role of governments. It only took us 2.5 hours to get through less than half of one of Thomas Sowell's books. Let's recap.
Starbucks, fuck yeah! Disney World, fuck yeah! Porno,
Okay, so this is going to sound a little robotic, but let's move on to part 3, which starts with Chapter 9, Productivity and Pay. In discussing the allocation of resources, we have so far been concerned largely with inanimate resources. But people are a key part of the inputs which produce output. Most people do not volunteer their labour free of charge, so they must be either paid to work or forced to work, since the work has to be done in any case if we are to live at all, much less to enjoy the various amenities that go into our modern standard of living. Sowell begins by acknowledging that labour is unique and requires a more thorough analysis than, say, the market for tables and chairs. He then spells out how a market economy allocates this unique resource in a rational manner. In many societies of the past, people were forced to work, whether as serfs or slaves. In a free society, people are paid to work. But pay is not just income to individuals. It is also a set of incentives facing everyone working or potentially working, and a set of constraints on employers so that they do not use the scarce resource of labour as was done in the days of the Soviet Union, keeping extra workers on hand just in case, when those workers could be doing something productive somewhere else. The Soviet Union. You really do live in Tom Sowell's head, rent-free.
The Soviet Union? I thought you guys broke up.
Yes, that's what we wanted you to think.
Okay, for real. The productivity and pay chapter of basic economics is not bad. Understanding the distribution of income, who gets what, isn't as straightforward as it can seem. Thousands of researchers, data collectors and policymakers work hard to make that distribution legible, though they might do a better job of communicating its intricacies, if you ask me. There are so many issues with reading the data that people can get confused. As Sowell notes, common sense reasons for income differences among individuals are often lost sight of in abstract discussions of the ambiguous term income distribution. Although people at the top income brackets and bottom income brackets, the rich and the poor, as they are often called, may be discussed as if they were different classes of people, often they are in fact people at different stages of their lives. 3/4 of those American workers who were in the bottom 20% in income in 1975 were also in the top 40% at some point over the next 16 years. When you track the entire distribution of income over time, from the poorest to the richest, what you're tracking are not so much people, but points on the distribution itself. This might sound abstract, but the issue is that people constantly change their position on the income distribution. When you compare income data year to year, you're not looking at the same people over time. All of the poorer people could get rich and the richer people could get poor, yet the distribution might show little change, they just swap places. You wouldn't realize what was going on just by looking at the stagnant income distribution. You'd need to understand the people underneath it. The formerly rich are now the poor, and vice versa. These are sometimes called composition effects, and they can really mess up our interpretations. There are tons of them. People moving between jobs can mess up income statistics for each occupation. People getting married or divorced can mess up income numbers for individuals versus for a whole household. There are also clear effects of age, or what economists call life cycle effects. When you're young, you earn little or nothing. When you're middle-aged, you're at your richest point. When you're old, you're on a pension and poorer once more. Sowell makes the life cycle point pretty well. Nothing is more straightforward and easy to understand than the fact that some people earn more than others for a variety of reasons. Some people are simply older than others, for example, and their additional years have given them opportunities to acquire more experience, skills, formal education, and on-the-job training, all of which allow them to do a given job more efficiently or to take on more complicated jobs that would be overwhelming for a beginner or for someone with only limited experience or training. It is hardly surprising that this leads to higher incomes. According to Sowell, one reason people move around the income distribution is that older people earn more than younger people, on average, because of experience and skills and progression up the ranks. It may seem kind of silly to compare a teenager at their first job in McDonald's to a senior banker. Now, this argument can be exaggerated. In the UK, young lawyers earn plenty of money straight away, while older teachers barely get a premium when compared to their younger counterparts. It's fair to be concerned about the low starting pay of teachers and the fact that it doesn't rise that much with age. Putting that to one side for now, let's say that Sowell's statements are valid. He's obviously spinning things a bit with his language, hardly surprising, but let's put that to one side too. As I see it, Sowell is painting a picture of most people missing this critical point. When some people are born, live, and die in poverty, while others are born, live, and die in luxury, that is a very different situation from one in which young people have not yet reached the income level of older people, such as their parents. But the kinds of statistics often cited in the media, even in academia, typically do not distinguish these very different situations. Moreover, those who publicize such statistics usually proceed as if they are talking about income differences between classes rather than differences between age brackets. But while it is possible for people to stay in the same income bracket for life, though they seldom do, it is not equally possible for them to stay in the same age bracket for life. You might wonder exactly who is making these mistakes. Sure, the man on the street probably doesn't get all of these nuances of income statistics, but Sowell repeatedly and characteristically rails against politicians, the media, and academics without citations, even though you learn about life cycle and age early on as an economist. Eventually, Sowell gives us a concrete example by putting two actual economists in his crosshairs. A detailed analysis of US census data showed that there were 40 million people in the bottom 20% of households in 2002, but 69 million people in the top 20% of households. Although the unwary might assume that these quintiles represent dividing the country into 5 equal layers, as two well-known economists have misstated it in a popular book, there is nothing equal about those layers. They represent grossly different numbers of people. If you watch part 1, you'll know that Sowell has an issue with taking his sources out of context. It's not that he's outright fabricating quotes or anything, it's just that he seems to miss the bigger picture most of the time. A typical Sowell misrepresentation would be to quote someone making a caveat to an argument, but only use the caveat and not note that the bulk of what they're saying goes against him. He does this to the point where I wondered if an H-Bomber Guy style expose simply detailing his misrepresentations one by one might have been enough for a second video. But in the productivity and pay chapter of Basic Economics, Sowell has clarified some important facets of the data, composition effects and life cycle effects. It's a decent section of the book overall. So he must represent his sources accurately here, right? Right? No! The book is called Economics Explained, everything you need to know about how the economy works and where it's going by Heilbronner and Thoreau, and I found the relevant passage.
There are many ways of describing income distribution. We will use a method that will divide the country into 5 equal layers, like a great cake. The layers will help us give dollars and cents definitions of what we usually have in mind when we speak of the poor, the working class, the middle class, and so on. As we will see, the amounts are not at all what most of us imagine.
So, yes, they do use the phrase divide the country into 5 equal layers, but they add like a great cake, which Sowell leaves out for some reason. It's a tool for communicating how income quintiles work, and a pretty good one at that. Income quintiles split the distribution into 5 layers, and a 5-layered cake of quintiles sticks in the mind. It seems kind of unfair not to acknowledge that point. I'm usually happy with colourful metaphors that simplify a bit. It's part of public communication, and as a public communicator, Sowell should appreciate that. Or maybe he'd prefer a stolid black and white photo as a metaphor. With that said, is Sowell right that there is a danger of Heilbronner and Thoreau confusing households and individuals because, in his words, they represent grossly different numbers of people? Well, Heilbronner and Thoreau continue.
We begin with the bottom layer, the poor. By our definition, this will include all the households in the bottom 20% of the nation. From data gathered by the Census Bureau, we know that the highest income of a family in this bottom slice of the 5-layered cake was about $13,000 in 1985. For purposes of comparison, the level of income designated by the Department of Commerce as near poverty for a 4-person family was $11,000 for that year. Thus, we exaggerate, but not too much, in thinking of the bottom fifth of the nation as poor or near poor.
When they actually discuss poverty, they explicitly use a poverty line for a 4-person family. In doing so, they account for household size. They are quite cautious in their conclusions, even if I don't agree with them completely. For example, I don't know why they take the 4-person household poverty line when the average household size at the time was lower than that, according to the Census Bureau. But Sowell doesn't engage in this kind of reasonable critique. He just cherry-picks sentence fragments to make people look worse than they are. He has to act like people are making mistakes and he is clearing up the mess. Actually, he's just creating more mess. Zeroing in on a cute metaphor used to communicate a point in a section which is consistent in its use of households, not individuals, is pretty unfair. What's more, Harbrunner and Thoreau immediately note that the categories are not static and that people move around, escaping poverty. In fact, they go into plenty of detail on many of the issues Sowell is concerned about. You might still think that Sowell is right that if we're talking about equal layers of a cake, we should just use individuals to avoid any confusion. But we have to ask, why are we looking at income distribution in the first place? The answer is that we're trying to understand access to resources, and when it comes to individuals versus households, it's more complex than that. You see, unlike most of the stuff I rabbit on about on YouTube, I've actually did real research on household finances. If Sowell wants to get pedantic and, well, actually people who are just using a fun analogy, well, actually, with income statistics, 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2. Let me explain. Households are a relevant unit because members of a household pool their incomes. Many cost of living can be reduced by living with others. This is pretty intuitive. The rent for a one-person home is higher per person than the rent for a similar two-person home, often much higher. Bills like electricity and internet won't go up that much with one more person in the house either. Cooking for 4 people doesn't cost 4 times as much as cooking a smaller version of that meal for one person, and so on. This is known as economies of scale. This has long been recognised by economists and econometricians, which is why they adjust household income numbers in a process called equivalization. You divide the total income of the household by a number which depends on the number of adults and on the number of children in that household. For example, the OECD equivalization scale starts at 1 for one person. Makes sense. For each additional adult, you add 0.7. For each additional child, you add 0.5. So if you had a 2-adult, 2-child family, the equivalized household size would be 2.7, even though the actual number of people in the household is 4. I've used this in my research, it's pretty common. Actually, if you didn't do it, people would shout at you in seminars. Or you'd better have a very good reason. There are therefore 3 main ways to look at the income distribution: individuals, households or families, equivalized households, which uses household income to give you a number for each individual. It's not that any of these are always right or always wrong. It depends on what you're saying and whether you are consistent and transparent with your definitions. Individuals are important, but they group together into households which are just qualitatively different to adding up the individuals within them, as Sowell wants to do. Again, if 2 single people live in one bed next to each other, that implies different things about their cost of living than if they knocked down the wall separating them so they both lived in a bigger 2-bed apartment. Sowell has a point that households alone obscure the number of individuals within them. He just only makes this point, instead of giving an honest and thorough exposition of the issues with household poverty that is up to date with how economists do things. In Discrimination and Disparities, he openly states that the only reason anyone would talk about households over individuals is ideology. You might be thinking that equivalized numbers seem like the best compromise between individuals and households, and that's reasonable. Equivalized income is the number most economists will settle on, depending on specifics of the data and the question they're asking. But now we have a new problem. Unlike the other two, equivalized income is not an actual visible magnitude. It's statistically constructed. Ask people what their individual income is and they'll have a good idea. Ask a family head what their household income is and they'll have a pretty good idea of that too. But try asking someone what their equivalized income is. The answer depends on whether the statistician uses the OECD scale or the square root scale or some other scale. It's not real. How could an actual person know what some economist far away deems their equivalized income?
Fairy dust. It doesn't exist.
By the way, as a behavioral economist, I think this issue of whether people are aware of magnitudes is underestimated and could make a good PhD thesis. It'd definitely be better than mine. Sowell wants to get pedantic about individuals versus households, but he fails to include these crucial details. You could leave this section thinking that Harbrunner and Thoreau are getting it wrong along with the media and everyone else, and that we should be using individual income statistics. This wouldn't make sense because the household is an important economic unit. Imagine if I were to mimic Sowell's style by taking phrases out of context from basic economics. I could say something like, nor are the households across the income distribution grossly different, as a prominent economist has misstated in a popular book. The household unit is the foundation of our standard of living. You might have heard about real wage stagnation for the average person in the USA. It's a big debate. Many claim that median wages have not really gone up and maybe gone down for most people in America, and the same may be true in my own country of the UK. But it's quite difficult to measure for some of the reasons we've discussed. Now, when Sowell is discussing trends in real wages, he notes that wages have gone up for individuals in the USA, but not as much for households. This is because the average household is smaller than it used to be. While that in itself is once more a fine point to make, Sowell has to do a Sowell. A Washington Post writer, for example, declared the incomes of most American households have remained stubbornly flat over the past 3 decades. It might be more accurate to say that some writers have remained stubbornly blind to economic facts. When 2 people in one household today earn the same total amount of money that 3 working people were earning in one household in the past, that is a 50% increase in income per person, even when household income remains the same. Okay, let's take a look at this source then. The article is called "Elderly Lead All in Financial Improvement." It was written by Barbara Vobeda in 1998 in the Washington Post. The part Sowell quotes is from the very beginning of the article.
While the incomes of most American households have remained stubbornly flat over the past 3 decades, the elderly have seen their financial circumstances improve dramatically, far outpacing every other demographic group, the Census Bureau reported yesterday.
So, household incomes being stubbornly flat is front and center. However, Sowell admits that it is placed in contrast with the elderly. This indicates that most American households means the non-elderly. Sowell even takes the quote mid-sentence and inserts a full stop where there is in fact a comma leading to the next part of the sentence, which he omits. But, does the article acknowledge different household compositions? Well, at the end, it literally lays them out in bullet points. This is a bit boring even for me, so I'll get someone who can make anything exciting to read it.
Between 1969 and 1996, median household income rose more for the elderly than for other Americans. Percent changes in median household income by type from 1969 to 1996. Okay, all households, 6.3%, all right? Married couples with children, including earnings of wives, 25.3%. That's a lot. Married couples with children, excluding earnings of wives, 1.5%. Okay, the wives enter the workforce. Big deal. Single male with children, no spouse, minus 8.1%. Bad news. Single female with children, no spouse, 10.2% increase. The women are working. Married, no children, 65 years or older, including incomes of wives, 57.4%. Oh my God. Married, no children, 65 years or older, excluding incomes of wives, 33.7%. Still a lot. The older people, a lot. With no children makes it more, and the wives, the wife matters. We work. Women work. Single male, 65 years or older, 63.2%. Let's get it. Single female, 65 years or older, 63%. Just point to women. The pay gap, but small, is women, if you're old, it's good.
There is an average increase of only 6%, but there are 8 statistics broken down by various characteristics, including household size. It's all there, and you'd have to be stubbornly blind not to see it. I don't want to come across as defending the media. The Washington Post can go suck a bag of donkey dicks, or whatever the fuck Americans say. I actually found a letter sent in about this article calling out for bad stats in its main argument, largely because the age 65 cutoff for elderly is inappropriate. Tom, that's what's known as addressing someone's central point. Read that letter, not Sowell. Vobeda's article doesn't seem great, and it certainly has a bad headline. Claiming that the elderly are doing better than everyone is just daft, or whatever Northerners say. But it explicitly contains income statistics broken down by household size and type. It does the thing Thomas Sowell is accusing it of not doing. Am I going insane? If you haven't followed every single one of these points, don't worry. What's important to take home is that there are countless ways of splicing income data. What matters is that you are clear and transparent about what you are doing, consistent with your definitions and careful with your data. When trying to understand the distribution of income, it's important to understand the purpose for which an author is using it. The Washington Post article is about the elderly, so why not even mention its central point? Harbrunner and Thorough are talking about family poverty, so why not at least mention their central point? Productivity is when I misrepresent people. Sowell's interventions generally have the effect of playing down inequality. If observed inequality between households is driven by household size, it's not actually unequal access to resources because individual incomes are more equal than we thought. This sounds fair at first, but household composition changing isn't definitely equivalent to incomes changing. As Paul Krugman put it,
it seems to be stretching the usefulness of the concept when the decision of US families to have fewer children is considered to be a form of income growth.
Also, quite a weird thing for a guy so committed to the family to gloss over. Sowell cannot honestly paint a picture where everyone else is getting it wrong because they aren't, at least not in the way he wishes. Journalists and other academics aren't clueless enough to leave out household composition and life cycle effects entirely. What's more, Sowell's framing distracts from just how biased his own discussion is. For example, at one point he just throws out that he doesn't think an income of $100,000 counts as rich, because vibes. Much discussion of the rich and the poor, or of the top and bottom 10 or 20%, fails to say just what kinds of incomes qualify to be in those categories. As of 2011, a household income of $101,583 was enough to put those who earned it in the top 20% of Americans. But a couple earning a little over $50,000 a year are hardly the rich. Even to make it to the top 5% required a household income of just over $186,000, that is, about $93,000 apiece for a working couple. That is a nice income, but rising to that level after working for decades at lower levels is hardly a sign of being rich.
That's a nice argument, Senator. Why don't you back it up with a source?
My source is that I made it the fuck up.
I'd say this excerpt is characteristic of Sowell. A few points. There is no citation for the claim that much discussion of the rich and the poor failed to say just what kinds of incomes qualify to be in those categories. For instance, national poverty lines are well defined by statistical bureaus, usually as a percentage of median national income. Sowell's judgments that these amounts are hardly the rich are completely arbitrary. Household income of $101,000 in 2011 is about $142,000 today, which I'd say is pretty well off. Rich, even. And $186,000 then is $265,000 today. Sorry, that's rich, although house prices are pretty wild, so bear that in mind. It's misleading to say that each member of a couple's income is just half of their total household income, given everything we've just said about household distribution. Sowell actually seems to think it's sensible to look only at individuals, which is completely out of whack with best practices and doesn't capture the standard of living of people cohabiting. He has no proof that those in the top 5% have risen to that level after working for decades at lower levels. There could be heirs. We simply do not know from his discussion. As Paul Krugman has noted, incomes at the very top really jump up. The average income of a family in the top 1% was $800,000 in 1993, or $1,745,611 today. The fact that the top 1% was literally the rallying cry of Occupy Wall Street suggests Sowell's choice of percentiles for what people mean when they say the rich is wildly off.
I made it the fuck up.
We all have this idea that we should move up a little bit from our parent station.
One of the most glaring omissions in Sowell's discussion of inequality is what's called intergenerational mobility, the relationship between parents and children's income. If income persists across generations, this means that those born poor are more likely to remain poor and those born rich are more likely to remain rich. Economists look at these measures to understand how mobility works and typically find that the USA doesn't fare so well. The most prominent example is Raj Shetty's work, which uses enormous data sets to investigate the American dream. This graph shows the rank of income of parents on the x-axis and the rank of their children at age 30 on the y-axis. Ranking is just ordering everyone in the income distribution from 0 for the poorest to 100 for the richest. If the USA had perfect mobility, this line would be flat. There would be no relationship between parents and child's incomes. Clearly, there is a positive relationship, and results show that a 1 percentage point increase in the parent's rank increases the child's rank by 0.34 percentage points. In other words, you inherit around a third of your parent's income rank. It's kind of difficult to get your head around what exactly this means, so on the right is a comparison with Denmark and with Canada, shown by the darker lines where the USA is light grey. Both Canada and Denmark have shallower slopes, so there is less of a relationship. In fact, it's half as small as the USA for both countries. The land of opportunity does not appear to be the USA because your parents' income matters much more for your lifetime prospects than it does in Denmark and Canada. Chetty et al. Take children's income at age 30, which ensures it is comparable across children. But you can also adjust for age statistically, as I again did for my PhD. It's simply common practice to account for the life cycle effects Sowell is worried about one way or another, as well as household size and random shocks like unemployment. After adjusting for all of this, I found that England was somewhere between the USA and Denmark or Canada. A 1 percentage point increase in the rank of the parents increases the rank of the child by 0.26 percentage points. This seems to fit fairly well with the common perception we have of ourselves in England, more like America than European countries, but not quite as bad. Having said that, I did use different methods, so it may not be comparable. You may have realised at this point that Sowell's central argument is that there is plenty of mobility and that over time the poorest tend to see large increases in income, while the richest see low growth or even declines. Among working Americans who were in the bottom 20% in income in 1975, approximately 95% had risen out of that bracket by 1991, including 29% who had reached the top quintile by 1991, compared to only 5% who still remained in the bottom quintile. The largest absolute amount of increase in income between 1975 and 1991 was among those people who were initially in the bottom quintile in 1975, and the least absolute increase in income was among those who were initially in the top quintile in 1975. He is correct that the poorest at any one time generally see larger subsequent increases in income. This is partly because they're younger, so their income will rise. Life cycle effects again. It's partly because those who fall on hard times tend to bounce back, something known as Ashenfelter's dip in economics. Those who get ill get better. Those who lose their job find another. Addicts recover. Even those who lose their houses come back. This is all fair. It's an observed phenomenon, on average. But this mobility can still all happen in a society which is massively unequal in its access to resources and opportunities. Sowell himself says that 95% of people in the bottom quintile rose out of it, including 29% who reached the top quintile. This doesn't quite prove the point he wants and may prove the opposite, because it describes a gap opening up over the lifetimes of these individuals. Most gained as they aged, but some gained more, and 29% ended up in the top quintile. Let me illustrate this in the style of one of those animations from Fallout.
Little Jimmy earns $10 an hour in his first job as a fry cook. 20 years later, he's a supervisor on $40,000 a year, overseeing the next generation of little guys looking to make their own way. Little Bobby starts out as a bank clerk, earning $10 an hour, fetching coffees for the big boys. Not for long he's earning the same as little Jimmy, yet 20 years later he's the head of a bank on a handsome salary of $80,000 a year.
Nothing about Sowell's example eliminates the possibility of huge gaps in lifetime income, and this is exactly what more comprehensive evidence suggests is going on. One study calculated lifetime incomes in the USA from 1957 to 2011. This takes every kind of income volatility Sowell is concerned about, changes due to age, due to luck, due to experience and skills, due to economic trends. They find that lifetime income inequality is roughly comparable to income inequality in a given year. For example, in the year 1980, the rich earned around 2 times more than those earning at the median. Sowell would caution that those who were poor in that year might subsequently get rich, and he'd be right. Yet, those who entered work at the same time could expect something similar over their entire lives. These inequalities aren't caused by temporary volatility or young age, they persist. The authors investigate whether or not the inequality in lifetime income is always there, or whether people start at similar levels and the inequality opens up over their lives. It turns out that it used to be more like little Bobby and Jimmy, where the inequality wasn't so bad at first, but increased by the time they got older. These days, Bobby and Jimmy start at different levels, and it only gets worse. You can also use lifetime incomes to investigate the question of income stagnation so poorly answered by Sowell with his discussion of household composition. Note that this study uses individual measures, Sowell's favourite, because it's hard to do lifetime income for anything but an individual. It turns out that median income stagnates over the past few decades in the USA, and this doesn't go away when you include healthcare and other employee benefits. Within each gender, inequality rises for lifetime income as well as for income in a given year. When you combine both genders, there is less of a rise in inequality because the entry of women into the workforce equalized incomes across the two genders. Whichever way you spin it, it seems that inequality is pretty high and has gotten worse. Sowell's contention that academics are somehow missing or hiding this is just false. Plus, when you take it into account, it doesn't much alter the conclusion that the USA is a country with high and worsening inequality where the average person has been making little progress for a while, albeit somewhat abetted by women entering the workforce. As one MSNBC article put it,
yes, in the United States, you will very likely enjoy a higher income when you're 45 than when you're 25, but you won't likely move from poverty to riches. If you want to travel from the bottom to the top, try being born in Western Europe. Merely wishing it were otherwise won't make it so.
Sowell does cite one study about lifetime incomes, but it's from New Zealand. Because of the movement of people from one income bracket to another over the years, the degree of income inequality over a lifetime is not the same as the degree of income inequality in a given year. A study in New Zealand found that the degree of income inequality over a working lifetime there was less than the degree of inequality in any given year during those lifetimes. Let's check the source then. Sowell cites one source, which itself got the finding from another source, one that's not easy to find and which Sowell himself does not appear to have read. What I found eventually was a book by the original study's author, John Creedy, which appears to contain a version of the study cited by the source that Sowell cites. As Sowell claims, it estimates that lifetime inequality in New Zealand is lower than inequality in a given year. The quality of this study is well below that of the one we just looked at. It's from 20 years earlier and the data are nowhere near as good. In fact, it only contains data for 3 years, from 1991 to 1993. It then uses this data to simulate the entire life cycle, people's whole careers. It therefore has to assume that the differences between 20-year-olds and 40-year-olds in 1991 are the same as differences between the same person when they're 20 in 1991 and when they're 40 in 2011. Technically, it uses cross-sectional data to estimate changes over time, which is a big assumption because things change. It's like saying the difference between me and my dad in the year I was born is the same as the difference between me when I was born and me now. There are countless factors that may affect our life cycle paths. Changes in the nature of work over the past few decades are a big one, for example. You couldn't have predicted these in the early 1990s. The US study we saw does not do that. It contains data for the entire life cycles of individuals, whereas this one only contains it for a few years. This data are simply miles ahead. When you've got all the information, you don't have to simulate it like this and make loads of assumptions. Now, I've got no beef with the researcher John Creedy. You do what you can with what you have. He acknowledges the limits of what he's doing several times. But once more, Sowell is behind the times, is not thorough in his exposition, and cherry-picks the bits that suit him. Sure, the Creedy study finds that lifetime inequality is lower than inequality in a given year, but this is just one of its many findings. The study still shows that inequality rises over the life cycle for men, just like little Jimmy and little Bobby. Even taking the study as true, these effects just don't do the work Sowell is implying that they do. Inequality is present and large in every case, even if there is some mobility counteracting this. I want to get out of this fiddly discussion of income distribution though, because these international comparisons lead us to a bigger omission from Sowell. Consider the section where he argues that the permanently rich and permanently poor are a smaller proportion of the population than people make out. If we count as genuinely poor that 5% of the population which remains in the bottom 20% over a period of years, then the genuinely rich and the genuinely poor put together add up to less than 10% of the American population. Nevertheless, some political rhetoric might suggest that most people are either haves or have-nots. There's no citation here for the statistical claim nor the political rhetoric, but let's take this at face value. As in, let's take virtually everything Sowell has said about the income distribution as true. In short, it's much more fluid than most discussions of inequality let on. Is it wrong to speak of the haves and the have-nots when mobility is this high? There is a Spanish film called The Platform, where prisoners are sent to a vertical prison. The floors have a huge hole in the middle of them, so you can see the floors both above and below your own. every day, a huge platter of food is gradually lowered down the prison on a pulley, stopping at each floor for 2 minutes. Those on the first floor get to eat their fill, and because of the size of the platter, it's good eaten for the next dozen or so floors as well. But by the time the platter gets halfway down, it's slim pickings. There may be some food left, enough not to starve, but it's tough if you're not close-ish to the top. At the bottom, forget about it. There's nothing left and people regularly starve or kill each other, sometimes resorting to cannibalism. Nobody knows how many floors there really are. Suffice to say, most people would regard this as a bad system that's completely unfair. But what I haven't told you is that once a month, the prisoners change floors. They are put to sleep and they wake up at an entirely new point in the vertical prison with differential access to food as a result. Our protagonist Goreng first wakes up in 48, a pretty good floor. He then goes to 171, where his cellmate tries to cannibalize him before he is saved. He is then on floor 33, then 202, where he himself resorts to cannibalism. He then gets to the dizzying heights of floor 6 before he resolves to travel all the way to the bottom, protecting the food along the way. Eventually, he and his companion reach floor 333, which seems to be the bottom. The platform raises the question: does the fact that the prisoners change floors every month eliminate the issues created by the inequality and poverty within the prison in any one month? And it seems obvious that the answer is no. We do not want people starving and fighting over food. We do not want people at the top of society to feast while others struggle. We do not want the animosity and hierarchy created by the structure of the prison itself. For the most part, a mobile prison is better for inmates than if the floors were fixed, because everybody has some chance of surviving as the months pass. If you ask me to choose, I'd go with the mobile prison. By my reckoning, each month I've got about a 25% chance of being on a floor where I get enough food. Over 6 months, I've got an 83% chance of ending up there at least once. Aren't probabilities fun? On the other hand, inequality plus mobility brings its own problems. Everyone is insecure. Even if they're at the top, they may soon be at the bottom. If I end up on a decent floor, next month I've once more got a mere 25% chance of staying nearby. Ad infinitum. With enough time, everyone will eventually starve. The attitude this creates is clear in the film. Those who have suffered but now find themselves on floor 10 relish their newfound bounty and take the opportunity to treat those below them terribly. Were the floors fixed indefinitely, you could even imagine a sense of duty developing among the higher-ups, a kind of noblesse oblige not to take too much. You could imagine those at the bottom banding together and rebelling, instilling the fear of God into the higher-ups. This was sometimes the case under more rigid hierarchical systems like feudalism and monarchism. And no, professional internet misunderstanders, I'm not yearning for those days. I'm merely saying that shit is complex. Some of these themes are explored in The Platform too, but that film is dreadful, don't watch it. The Platform makes us question what arguments that emphasize social mobility really mean for inequality. The distribution of income in the prison is roughly fixed, but as Sowell would hasten to point out, people are moving around all the time. Yet as Sowell wouldn't hasten to point out, this fact doesn't do much to negate the inequality. Now, there are lots of differences between the platform and reality. That's why it's a metaphor. For instance, there is no work as such, no skill and no effort. People aren't producing the food or doing some task which rewards them with food points that determine their floor. People could be required to, say, build houses out of Lego, and the more you make, the higher you go next time. But even if they were, would we not still question the structure of the prison? Suppose you get a really unproductive cellmate, so your floor's total production is low even though yours is high. Suppose you fall ill one month or have a long-term disability that lowers your productivity. Suppose you're at such a low floor to start with that you barely eat, so cannot work. Hell, suppose some people are just really good at building Lego houses. How much does this matter? The thing is, through his exploration of how much income can vary across someone's life due to age, career, household size, and whatever, Thomas Sowell has stumbled upon one of the contemporary justifications for a welfare state. That is, whether owing to recessions, the rise and fall of different industries, having children, aging, discrimination, class, sickness, bad luck, or even undoubted personal failings, The aim is to create a ceiling and a floor. Your income won't get so low that you experience poverty at any point, even though this means higher taxes reducing the highs at other points in your life. The very fact that people's income varies over their lives is a good reason to smooth out those fluctuations. Just as we redistribute from the rich to the poor in the current moment, we redistribute from someone when they're a senior banker to that same person when they have their first job at McDonald's. In practice, this means that at any moment, older workers will be paying taxes to support younger workers, but each will have the assurance that the system supports them throughout their lives. To this end, the banker will be protected after retirement, at which point the former teenager will be paying taxes to fund their pension. In The Welfare State as Piggy Bank, economist Nicholas Barr notes how much people have neglected this role of the welfare state.
Even if all poverty and social exclusion could be eliminated so that the entire population were middle class, there would still be a need for institutions to enable people to insure themselves and to redistribute over the life cycle. Though private institutions are often effective, they face predictable problems, and attempts to address those problems inescapably involve state intervention. Thus, the welfare state exists not only to relieve poverty, but also to provide insurance and consumption smoothing. The argument that the welfare state has an efficiency function is important. The resulting gains to well-being are potentially enormous and affect the entire population. Between 2/3 and 3/4 of UK welfare state spending is life cycle redistribution, with only 1/3 or less on poverty relief. In quantitative terms, it might therefore be argued that the piggy-banked aspect is the key function of the welfare state.
It is strange that this argument seems to have passed Sowell by. Barr's book was written in 2001 and is filled with citations from long before that. The book itself has over 1,000 citations on Google Scholar, twice as many as Sowell's book, the latest edition of which came out in 2014. Why does Sowell ignore this argument entirely? Despite his insistence that he's just here to tell you about the economics, his analysis is decidedly incomplete. Sowell also omits other considerations you will find in economics, even basic economics. A common approach to understanding social mobility and poverty is to use income brackets, the top 10%, bottom 20%, and so on. And a common critique argues that this does not tell us much about living standards, as Sowell states. If our concern is with the economic well-being of flesh and blood human beings, as distinguished from statistical comparisons between income brackets, then we need to look at real income per capita, because people do not live on percentage shares, they live on real income. I can understand why people find this compelling. Shares of income are just statistical constructs, whereas real income measures access to resources. Sowell is also, for once, correct in what he is criticising. Many poverty measures are relative. But he ignores a simple counter-argument. As Sowell is focused on economic well-being and real income, if redistributing real income from rich to poor people increases well-being, he'd have to advocate for it. There's a basic economic concept called diminishing marginal utility of income, which we'll just call DMU for short. The idea is that resources are worth much more to a poor person than to a rich person. It's a reasonable assumption and one that most people recognize to be true.
It's $1,000. Burns would can my butt in no time flat.
Ooh, $1,000? So what? To Mr. Burns, that's one less ivory back scratcher.
Once you get above a certain level of wealth, you get no incremental happiness. So why on earth would you not go back to a tax policy of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, where say above, pick a big number, 10 million, you actually pay more than 10%, maybe more than 20%, maybe more than 50%, because the difference between 30,000 a year for a household and 50,000 is enormous to the well-being of that household. Low-income kids in low-income households have higher resting blood pressure, but the difference between making 10 million a year and 15 million a year offers you no happiness.
Progressive economists regularly use DMU to argue for redistribution. Paul Krugman, for example.
Diminishing marginal utility is the common sense notion that an extra dollar is worth a lot less in satisfaction to people with very high incomes to those with low incomes. Give a family with an annual income of $20,000 an extra $1,000, and it will make a big difference to their lives. Give a guy who makes $1 million extra $1,000 and he'll barely notice it. What this implies for economic policy is that we shouldn't care what a policy does to the incomes of the very rich. A policy that makes the rich a bit poorer will affect only a handful of people, and will barely affect their life satisfaction, since they will still be able to buy whatever they want.
When people talk about percentage shares, they're implicitly concerned about making sure that those who have less aren't too far from those who have more, which will hopefully maximize economic well-being in Sowell's parlance. Food taken from floor 1 will better benefit those at the bottom or even in the middle of the prison. Diminishing marginal utility may be a common sense notion, but various in-depth studies typically confirm it, at least in broad strokes. Layard et al. Used data on individual self-reported happiness across 50 countries and find that income increases people's happiness more when they are poor versus when they are rich. The change happens quite fast as income rises, indicating redistribution increases total happiness substantially. Easterlin uses cross-country data on self-reported happiness to show not just diminishing marginal utility, but zero marginal utility at high levels of income. So the rich do not gain at all from higher income, which is consistent with Easterlin's other work on happiness. Horowitz et al. Show diminishing marginal utility for specific items like mugs and sports cars. This isn't the same as looking at income, but if people's need for individual things gradually gets satiated as their income increases, it coheres. On that note, Bain and Bongiorno show that people with less income want more things than those with more incomes. Note that this is an explanation for diminishing marginal utility of income, which is consistent with the Horowitz paper because people's individual wants are disappearing with higher incomes. Kimball et al. Use hypothetical choice experiments to show that diminishing marginal utility is widespread, but better thought of as driven by several different factors. Risk appetite, patience, altruism, and anti-inequality attitudes may be a finer-grained way to look at it. All of these studies have their nuances and their flaws, but few contradict the basic idea of diminishing marginal utility of income. The idea is a cornerstone of basic economics, and the notion that it supports redistribution is a common one. It's utterly bizarre for Sowell to omit it entirely. There is a ton of discussion to be had about when exactly DMU applies and especially why. In my view, it is a general assumption that abstracts from a number of complex potential explanations, from simple satiation with higher income to the existence of needs, to the prevalence of relative comparisons. I've touched on this before in both Sowell Part 1 and in my Steven Pinker video, and I'd like to bring it all together at some point, but it's a bit of a tangent for now. Maybe I'll do it for patrons. Hey, sign up for exclusive content and also a book club for higher tiers. We'll be reading Angus Dayton's Economics in America next. This channel is ad-free, so I rely on my patrons. Love y'all. My bottom line is that when you think in concrete terms about the good that money can do for the relatively poor, this point comes into focus. For example, I have a Colombian friend who has moved to Washington, D.C. to work at the World Bank. She has commented that she dislikes the USA because of the level of poverty and inequality, and actually she is now moving away. Again, she's from Colombia, a place known for its high inequality and poverty. Her reasoning was that, yes, true poverty in Colombia is worse than that in the USA, but not by much. Not as much as you might think. And in the USA, there really is no excuse. The resources exist, they're just not being directed towards those who need them most. Nicholas Barr's argument for the welfare state as a piggy bank also sits nicely with diminishing marginal utility. Smoothing out income fluctuations across the life cycle will increase the average well-being of a person. The money is worth more to the teenager at McDonald's than to the senior banker simply because they are poorer. This still applies when the teenager and the banker are the same individual at different stages in their life. And this anodyne framing understates the problem. Obviously, being young shouldn't mean you have to eat shit. Outside of direct transfers, minimum wages are one way to redistribute from older, middle-class employers and consumers to younger, poorer workers. Hold on, we'll get there. In summary, the welfare state increases economic well-being by distributing income to those who need it most when they are poorer for whatever reason they may be poor and for however long their poverty may continue. We can have debates about how exactly to do this, but it will increase the welfare of the population. The big remaining question is whether a heavier welfare state, which aims to reduce inequality and provide, will reduce total wealth available to people. Perhaps it will backfire so that a bigger welfare state results in lower welfare for the poor because growth is just so low and nobody invests. Sowell is fond of arguing that higher taxes and higher benefits will disincentivize work and wealth creation. Income is an obvious incentive, and because it is an incentive affecting economic behavior at all levels, we cannot treat incomes as if they were just numbers that we can change to suit our wishes, without considering how that will change behavior and the economic consequences that follow from behavior. Such consequences of changed behavior affect the output on which the standard of living of a whole society depends. So, will government redistribution hurt more than it will help? Thomas Sowell is mad at words. Words like distribution. Earlier, when discussing the income distribution, remember that he said, common sense reasons for income differences among individuals are often lost sight of in abstract discussions of the ambiguous term income distribution. Shortly after this, Sowell compares the distribution of income to the distribution of height and speaks of instead saying in plain English that some people make more money than others, because there's nothing loaded about the term make money. Sowell is mad at words like fairness, which he wrote a whole essay about. If there is ever a contest to pick which word has done the most damage to people's thinking and to actions to carry out that thinking, my nomination would be the word fair. It is a word thrown around by far more people than have ever bothered to even try to define it. In fact, he is mad at many words. Preoccupation with disparities, gaps, and inequities has largely been the hallmark of the intelligentsia, the media, and politicians. He doesn't like any picture of the income distribution that doesn't paint it as natural and unchangeable. So don't talk about inequality or poverty, they're made up. Talk about non-made up terms like demand and supply. But Sowell is especially mad about trickle-down economics. He wrote an entire pamphlet in 2012 about how critics of tax cuts for the wealthy often use the term trickle-down, even though it is a meaningless straw man that hasn't been seriously proposed by economists. So, yeah, in politics people are often imprecise with their terminology. People often make up terms to refer to their opponent's ideas that the opponents don't use themselves. A good placard doesn't generally make a good policy brief. The term trickle-down should not be interpreted too literally as income actually trickling down from rich to poor. And it doesn't refer to any serious economic theory, that's also true. But really? Ranting for 20 pages about the use of a specific term? The very idea that profits trickle down to workers depicts the economic sequence of events in the opposite order from that in the real world. Workers must first be hired and commitments made to pay them before there is any output produced to sell for a profit, and independently of whether that output subsequently sells for a profit or at a loss. With many investments, whether they lead to a profit or a loss can often be determined only years later, and workers will have to be paid in the meantime rather than waiting for profits to trickle down to them. This is an extremely pedantic section that interprets opponents of trickle-down as literally saying individual company profits trickle down to workers without citation, when actually trickle-down economics is just a neat, if snarky way of characterizing arguments that people have actually made. This is just like when he got mad about the cake metaphor for income quintiles. The irony is that Sowell just ends up defending something that could reasonably be classed as trickle-down economics. The real effect of tax rate reductions is to make the future prospects of profit look more favourable, leading to more current investments that generate more current economic activity and more jobs. Wow, it's almost like the benefits of the investments made by rich people trickle down. Sowell's substantive analysis in this pamphlet rejects the amorphous term trickle-down theory and substitutes the more specific Laffer curve. At various times and places, particular individuals have argued that existing tax rates are so high that the government could collect more tax revenues if it lowered those tax rates, because the changed incentives would lead to more economic activity, resulting in more tax revenues out of rising incomes, even though the tax rate was lowered. This is clearly a testable hypothesis that people might argue for or against on either empirical or analytical grounds, but that is seldom what happens. The familiar curve shape shows zero revenue at zero tax rates and zero revenue at 100% tax rates. In the middle is the sweet spot where revenues are maximized. But the Laffer curve is an equally problematic idea that George H.W. Bush famously referred to as voodoo economics. Is Sowell going to write about how no real economist has advocated for voodoo too? In any case, Sowell's analysis of the Laffer curve leaves a lot to be desired. For example, in 1921, when the tax rate on people making over $100,000 a year was 73%, the federal government collected a little over $700 million in income taxes, of which 30% was paid by those making over $100,000. By 1929, after a series of tax rate reductions had cut the tax rate to 24% on those making over $100,000, the federal government collected more than $1 billion in income taxes, of which 65% was collected from those making over $100,000. In sum, the government collected more from high earners when rates were lower. Just one teensy problem. In 1921, the USA was at the bottom of a recession, while in 1929, it was at the top of a boom. I cannot overstate how much economists know not to compare the bottom of a recession with the top of a boom. They don't do it. Obviously, economic activity and tax revenues were higher in the boom, and this was not necessarily because of the tax rates. Sowell then goes into a little more detail. He tries to establish that tax avoidance schemes are higher with higher tax revenues, but he uses data from 1916 to 1921 to do this, which obviously doesn't cover the period to 1929. Even putting this to one side, 1916 to 21 is hugely confounded by a war and a pandemic. It's just not a good period to infer anything from. Modern work on the Laffer curve generally finds that we're on the left-hand side of it, so raising tax rates would increase revenues. One of the best known papers is by Traban and Uhlig in 2011, and it shows that increases in both labour and capital taxes could raise revenues somewhat in the EU and even more in the USA. This work is mathematically complex and full of assumptions, but it was released a year before Sowell's pamphlet, and he doesn't even mention it. Most of the work done in public economics centres the diminishing marginal utility of income. It tries to balance these two competing forces. Higher taxes and transfers discourage economic activity, but they benefit the poor more than the rich. In a 2011 review, Diamond and Sayers state the problem clearly.
Social welfare is larger when resources are more equally distributed, but redistributive taxes and transfers can negatively affect incentives to work, save, and earn income in the first place.
Diamond and Sayers make 3 recommendations based on existing evidence. First, very high earnings should be subject to rising marginal tax rates and higher rates than current US policy for top earners. Second, tax and transfer policy towards low earners should include subsidization of earnings and should phase out the subsidization at a relatively high income. Third, capital income should be taxed. Estimating all of these effects is extremely complicated, and I'd like to go into it more in a separate video about taxes someday. I'm also not touching corporation tax here because that's a whole thing. The important points to take away from the Diamond and Sayers review are that almost every study seems to find that a higher US top tax rate is justified compared to the current one. What's more, this result is quite robust to differences in assumptions, methods, and datasets. It's common for papers in the literature to recommend a top marginal tax rate of 70% plus, when the current one in the USA is only 40%. Once more, this paper is from the year before Sowell's book came out, and it discusses canonical studies that have been around for decades. You can contest the approach, but the bottom line is that Sowell just leaves this stuff out in all of his books. He is not tackling the modern, sophisticated, empirical case for redistribution, nor is he tackling the modern, sophisticated, empirical characterization of inequality, mobility, and opportunity. Now, some of Sowell's discussion of the 1920s and the approach to taxing the rich back then is interesting as historical context. I'd even say he has a point that tax avoidance might be lower under lower rates of tax. Yet, even if he's right that higher tax rates lead to more avoidance schemes, this would make the case for something different than he thinks. If we want to get annoyed about how language obfuscates reality, then we better get annoyed about how higher tax rates are often discussed in terms of losing revenue rather than in terms of tackling tax avoidance. As economist Jamie Morgan put it,
the Laffer theorem has provided ideational rather than definite empirical support for the principle that we should generally prefer tax rate reductions. It has, through a confused set of claims regarding competition, contributed to a sense that tax avoidance is a signal of inefficiently high tax rates rather than opportunistic behavior based on the exercise of power.
Concomitantly, the Laffer theorem has contributed to the socialization of citizens, despite the fact that few citizens today could probably put a name to it, and despite that economic theory has, to some degree, become more diverse and sophisticated since the theorem was first set out.
Recent audits of the rich by the IRS return the money put into them several-fold. So that's another way of collecting more revenue from top earners. There is more than one way to skin a cat, a point also made by Diamond and Sayers. Indeed, Sowell's own discussion notes that Secretary of the Treasury Andrew Mellon originally wanted to tackle the tax-exempt securities that the rich were using in the 1920s, but had to settle for lower tax rates as a compromise. We don't need to compromise. It's been proven that auditing the rich increases the tax revenues raised from them without lowering their tax rates. There's no need for trickle-down, however defined. Ironically, Sowell's pamphlet insisting people represent others accurately and be precise with their terminology just distracts from the main issues and in-depth studies done on it. Modern evidence suggests that increasing tax rates will increase revenues and benefit the poor. Let's summarize Sowell's arguments surrounding inequality, mobility, and redistribution. First, income mobility is higher than most people realize. People move around the distribution a lot. Second, many reasons for inequality in the statistics are organic, like household size or age. Like-for-like comparisons would show that inequality is lower than people think. Third, high tax rates on the rich endanger wealth creation and even revenues, a cost of redistribution which needs to be considered. I'd say that taken in isolation, each of these can be useful things to bear in mind when approaching the thorny issue of income distribution. I said that his chapter on productivity and pay wasn't too bad, and I stand by that. However, Sowell's discussion is marred by its own major problems. First, consistent misrepresentation of sources to make it seem like they're overstating inequality and poverty when they aren't, with Sowell himself misunderstanding how household size interacts with living standards. Second, failure to consider that income mobility, whatever its causes, may be an argument in favour of a piggy bank welfare state. Third, omission of several well-known arguments in favour of redistribution from rich to poor, most notably diminishing marginal utility. All in all, most modern research and evidence in economics indicates that inequality is high and persistent both within lifetimes and between generations. It also indicates that we can raise taxes and fund the welfare state without destroying the American dream. But there's something at the heart of all this that we haven't really discussed yet. For Sowell, incomes are simply a reflection of how productive you are. At one point he approvingly quotes the libertarian economist Henry Hazlitt.
The real problem of poverty is not a problem of distribution, but of production. The poor are poor not because something is being withheld from them, but because, for whatever reason, they are not producing enough.
Hazlitt, your time will come. To be fair to Sowell, he is careful not to essentialize or blame the poor for their situation, and he says this numerous times. The poor themselves may not be to blame because their poverty may be due to many factors beyond their control, including the past, which is beyond anyone's control today. So, blame may not be warranted for Sowell, but regardless, he still thinks these factors are tough to change.
I'm not tough. Life is tough.
There is no debate that speaks to this proposition more directly than the one about the minimum wage. Have you ever heard of a country called Europe? The government, passes laws that, help people and shit. It's fucking weird, man! The minimum wage chapter of Basic Economics is possibly the most exasperating example of selective use of evidence by Sowell. That is quite a big claim when the guy has such a questionable relationship with sources, but the minimum wage chapter hits different. Sowell acts like he's engaging with academic literature, but he's not. Not in a serious way. This is actually more tiring than when he just misrepresents sources because it's more subtle and seems more credible to his readers. Sowell wants to claim that the minimum wage is an imposition into the market which simply disallows employers from hiring at the optimal level of wages, therefore increasing unemployment. Making it illegal to pay less than a given amount does not make a worker's productivity worth that amount, and if it is not, that worker is unlikely to be employed. He illustrates this by highlighting Switzerland, Hong Kong, and Singapore as countries that do not have minimum wages and also boast low unemployment. Oh, right. Forget what I said. Job done. I thought we had to do a whole section on this, but that settles it. A handful of countries have both no minimum wage and low unemployment. We don't need to do anything more. It's not like there's anything else going on in those countries that might affect those magnitudes. Unemployment and the minimum wage are the only variables we need to include in our model, and these three countries are probably representative of the world in general. What's this? A map. Ah, a map. Hey, wait a minute. There are a lot of countries on here other than Switzerland, Hong Kong, and Singapore. What's this country? Australia.
Australia. I'll be damned. Look at this country. You are gay.
Well, it says on this website that they have 3.7% unemployment, and on this other website that their minimum wage is 55% of the national median, one of the highest in the world. Well, that's probably just a one-off. I mean, Australia's a wacky place. That's where you'll find things like kangaroos, koalas, and economics explained. But wait a second. New Zealand, which is right next to Australia, has an even higher minimum wage and unemployment of only 4%. They were actually the first to introduce a minimum wage. What's this country? South Korea. Is there a North Korea? It says South Korea has their minimum wage at 53% of the national median, but an unemployment rate of 2.9%, lower than Sowell's favourite example of Switzerland. What's this country near Switzerland? Germany. Where have I heard that word before? The explicit minimum wage rate understates the labour costs imposed by European governments, which also mandate various employer contributions to pension plans and health benefits, among other things. Higher costs in the form of mandated benefits have the same economic effect as high costs in the form of minimum wage laws. Europe's unemployment rates shot up when such government-mandated benefits, to be paid for by employers, grew sharply during the 1980s and 1990s. In Germany, such benefits accounted for half of the average labour cost per hour. By comparison, such benefits accounted for less than 1/4 the average labour costs per hour in Japan and the United States. Average hourly compensation of manufacturing employees in the European Union countries in general is higher than in the United States or Japan. So is unemployment. Okay, why does Sowell make a general statement about Europe, but then switch to Germany, and then switch back again? Germany boasts a world-beating manufacturing sector with massive amounts of labour protections. They also have 3.1% unemployment, with a minimum wage at 48% of the median. I'm beginning to suspect these comparisons aren't as detailed or systematic as we might need them to be.
Do you know anything about Germany?
Well, it's a country in Europe.
Good, I'm learning.
You might say he's simplifying for a broad audience, but when his examples are this biased, it's actively misleading. Cross-country comparisons of quantitative data are generally bad except as a first look, and certainly not if you pick only 3 of them. They can provide perspective and raise questions about certain theories, but you've always got to go deeper. Investigating economic policy in this way is a bit like trying to investigate how diet and exercise affect health through data gathered in a large survey. It might give you clues, but without careful control of the people you're studying, there's just too much going on to be sure of any conclusions. Are vegetarians having fewer heart attacks because of their diet, or because they are more health-conscious people in general, and more health-conscious people are more likely to become vegetarian? Or because middle-class people are more likely to be vegetarian, and also are more healthy? Try answering that convincingly with a high-level survey across a whole country. That's why modern nutrition and health research uses proper trials. You need to know whether or not cherries are... good for you. There are many potential issues with looking at the relationship between minimum wages and unemployment. Lots of complicated features of the world affect both, something economists call heterogeneity. In plain English, this means that there are big differences in economies across time and place that will affect everything we're looking at. Here are just a few examples for wages and employment. Differences in the demographic makeup of workers in age, race, or education. Young workers, those with little education, and African Americans are more likely to work at the minimum wage. Long-term trends like the entry of women into the workforce. Women are also more likely to be affected by the minimum wage. Differences in types of industry, level of monopoly, agglomeration effects, and so on. Silicon Valley is a unique place that arguably should not be lumped in with the rest. It requires detailed study in its own right. Things that happen at certain points in time, like the recession of the 1990s. This caused a general decline in employment, which hit low-wage workers harder. Amorphous cultural factors specific to each US state, like Texas tough, or Californian hippies, or the Seattle freeze, or Arkansas racism. Things specific to each state at each point in time. For example, other policies like tax increases, along with broader political shifts like a campaign against obesity. Remember all the stuff about age, household composition, gender, and how those affected income distribution and mobility. That was heterogeneity. Remember the word. Thomas Sowell is aware of all this at an abstract level. The statistical complexities of separating out the effects of minimum wage rates on employment from all the other ever-changing variables which also affect employment mean that honest differences of opinion are possible when examining empirical data. There is room for reasonable disagreement, but Sowell goes on to present the most one-sided shit you've ever seen in your life. Fuck, cherries are actually well nice. Crudely comparing countries like Sowell did is a terrible way to deal with heterogeneity. Imagine the heterogeneity between not just locations within one country, but between a low-income island in the Pacific, a middle-income country in Latin America, and a high-income Scandinavian country. There are just too many variables to bother. Even if you were using the most advanced statistical techniques, you'd likely miss something important. Sowell does move on to better analysis, but he repeatedly and confidently asserts that it has found that minimum wages have reliably increased unemployment. This is just not the case for anybody familiar with modern evidence on the topic. When all is said and done, most empirical studies indicate that minimum wage laws reduce employment in general, and especially the employment of younger, less skilled, and minority workers. Let's check the source then. This is a 1995 paper called Employment and the 1990-1991 Minimum Wage Hike by Deere et al. It looks at hikes in the federal minimum wage in 1990 and the associated effects on employment across the USA. They find that employment among teenagers seems to decline with the introduction of the minimum wage. A drop in employment was also observed for disadvantaged ethnicities, those with no education, and unmarried people. All fair candidates for those more likely to be impacted by the minimum wage. This is quite a random paper to cite because it's not that well known and its methods are dated. Actually, it's technically not a paper published in a journal, but a papers and proceedings, which is like a shorter academic note. With the amount of things published on the minimum wage these days, I'm not even sure where Sowell found this paper and why he centers it. I don't want to dismiss it as a piece of research in its own right, especially given that it's 30 years old. They account for several sources of heterogeneity, demographic differences, time trends, and differences between states. People with degrees are different to those without. 1991 is different to 1989. Texas is different to California. So far, so good. Although they account for the fact that states are different and that years are different, they don't account for something we mentioned earlier, the fact that each state itself changes differently over time. This might sound a bit pedantic, but it's directly relevant. Think about it. When a state introduces or increases its minimum wage, is there a good chance that state has experienced some economic, social, or political changes that have prompted this?
Yes.
It complicates the whole thing because the very policy we're trying to isolate is caused by these changes, which in turn affect the things the policy is trying to change, like employment. For instance, there is evidence that employment is usually growing faster in parts of the USA where the minimum wage is low, like the South, and slower in parts where the minimum wage is high, like the Northeast. This is a massive source of heterogeneity that is different in each time and place. If you think I'm just making up random objections, then you should note that the Deere paper itself states this.
For the gender and geographic splits, we find that the minimum wage responses are swamped by the broader trends of increasing labor market participation of women and of employment expansion in the South and Southwest, where wages are lower than in the Northeast, Upper Midwest, and West.
Their overall finding is that the minimum wage reduces employment. In the cases where it doesn't have the predicted effect, though, they appeal to this heterogeneity, these other things that counteract the minimum wage.
We do not view our gender and state findings as a refutation of the law of demand. Instead, We take them as a warning that minimum wages are not everything that affects employment, and that other things must be considered before we can correctly assess the employment effects of minimum wages.
This is true, but the problem is that because they do not account for these things, their method is inadequate as a whole. It's quite weird to bring in these considerations when your results go against the law of demand, but not when they confirm it. Regardless of the merits of this paper, it's clear Sowell's sources on the minimum wage are limited and dated. Looking through the references, he has citations from between 1991 and 2013, with the latest academic research from 2006. In Discrimination and Disparities, he cites statistics from the 1940s.
New shit has come to light! And shit, man!
His most important source of evidence is a 2006 literature review by Newmark and Vasher. Now, I don't want to sound too picky, but when Sowell first says most empirical studies show employment reductions from the minimum wage, he cites the Deere paper we just discussed, which, regardless of its merits or drawbacks, is one study. Not most empirical studies. He goes on to cite the 2006 review in the next paragraph, which he should have cited in the first place. I don't even know what work the Deere study is doing for Sowell because he doesn't give a detailed account of its findings and methods. What I'm saying is, Sowell quotes the review. Despite the various approaches and methods used in these studies, this literature as a whole was one largely solidifying the conventional view that minimum wages reduce employment among low-skilled workers. I cannot tell you how much I hate this. It doesn't tell you what was in the review and why it came to those conclusions. It just quotes their conclusion and treats it as if it were gospel. Is this how you teach people economics? Find a couple of papers that agree with your beliefs and then barely explain them. Even if the review's a good one, this is hardly enough for a book which sells itself as a guide to the subject. Plus, there are plenty of other reviews Sowell leaves out. He's hiding behind the literature, not explaining it. I could leave it here with the 2006 Newmark and Vasher paper, but I'm going to talk about it because people will ask. Warning, this is going to be a bit academic, but hopefully helpful for those of you unfamiliar with reviews or the minimum wage literature. If you don't want to know about it, it's honestly fine, just skip to... This is a kind of...
that's just like... your opinion, man.
I'm not a massive fan of Newmark and Vasher 2006. I'll be honest with you, maybe it's because of my own biases. Bear that in mind. But as far as reviews go, it's arbitrary and subjective. We teach our students that a good review is extremely clear about which studies it is going to include and how it is going to evaluate them. You can do this by specifying which search terms you use in a proper structured search of Google Scholar or another academic database. You specify what you're interested in this case, the effect of the minimum wage on employment. Then you go through each study you uncovered via the search and see if it is actually looking at this effect. Despite searching for the right thing, you could feasibly end up with some study of wages in Ghana in 1950 because search engines do be like that, especially since they started deteriorating. You exclude certain studies for reasons which were specified at the start of the review. At my university, we used the Prisma diagram, which has the stages of identification, screening, eligibility, and inclusion. No, that doesn't spell out Prisma. That's just the name of the organization that came up with it. You don't need to read every word on here. Just know that at each stage, you look at the papers in more detail. First the search results, then the title and abstract, then the full paper. There are other approaches. What's important is how systematic and transparent this is. Newmark and Vasher don't do this or anything like it. With your studies selected, you need to think about how to evaluate them. What is the general consensus? Meta-analysis is one of the most common methods for quantitative studies like the effect of the minimum wage on employment. This weights each statistical estimate of the effect by how precise it is and therefore forms a meta-estimate of what the overall consensus is. This meta-analysis is from Doko-Liagos and Stanley 2009. On the x-axis is the response of employment to the minimum wage, called the elasticity. On the y-axis is a measure of statistical precision. The higher the number, the more precise the estimate. We can see a few things. The majority of estimates are very close to zero, suggestive of a small effect. The estimates closer to zero are generally higher on the figure, which means they are estimated more precisely. This indicates that the zero estimates are the more credible ones. More on that shortly. If you look closely, there is an asymmetry with more estimates on the negative side of 0 than on the positive side. You may think this is evidence in favour of a negative effect of the minimum wage on employment, as detailed by Sowell, but we'll return to that too. Newmark and Vasher don't do a meta-analysis. They say,
in putting together this review, we have intentionally eschewed a formal meta-analysis in favor of a traditional narrative review that attempts to provide a sense of the quality of the research and tries to highlight and synthesize the findings that we regard as more credible. Given the many different types of employment effects estimated in the literature, and the considerable variation in approaches and in the quality of the research, lumping the studies into one meta-analysis does not seem the best way to make sense of the literature.
They have a point. Meta-analyses can flatten what's interesting about different studies into a single graph. One study might be in one place and time and another is in another place at another time. One study might look at teen employment while another looks at overall employment. They might use completely different methods. Just lumping them all together on a graph and treating each study as a data point may be inappropriate. But what do they regard as credible research? They don't tell us. What follows is a lengthy and meandering 180-page discussion of various studies that they just seem to know.
You just know.
It's quasi-historical, going into the history of minimum wage research. Don't get me wrong, it's informative, but it reads more like a reflection than a serious review, given their lack of specificity about how they arrived at their chosen studies. No prisma, no nothing. They discuss each study and potential criticisms of that study one by one. The criticisms could be anything. They range from which variables are included and excluded to estimates being absurd, according to Newmark and Vasher. Now, from my reading, there are some themes that emerge. They think that you need to look at the effects on unemployment stretching into the past and future as well as immediate ones. They aren't fans of studies which focus on one time and place because that's not generalizable to the whole economy. They think teenage unemployment is one of the more important outcomes to focus on because teens are the most likely to work in minimum wage jobs. They think hours worked is as important as employment. Employers may reduce hours worked instead of outright firing people, and not enough studies check this. All reasonable. But why not just restrict your review to the studies you think are best placed on pre-specified criteria, then analyze them consistently using said criteria? It's funny because they dismiss meta-analysis as lumping everything together, then lump everything together. Old studies, new studies, effects on teen employment versus aggregate employment, drastically different statistical approaches. It's like they're making it up as they go along. To wit, one of the key debates in the minimum wage literature is about publication bias. Studies that found a negative effect on employment were more likely to be published for a long time. Studies that found a positive or zero effect were left in the file drawer. Returning to Doukiaglos and Stanley, given the most precise effects center around zero, we'd expect an even distribution of both positive and negative effects around it by chance. That's how these methods work. As you can see, there is a weird asymmetry in the graph with an unexpectedly high number of negative estimates. Doukiaglos and Stanley themselves report evidence of publication bias loaded towards finding negative estimates of the minimum wage. This is funny because it is itself evidence of a bias within the profession. We'll return to that later, though more recent analyses do show this bias seems to have dissipated. To summarize, if the effect were negative, we'd expect a symmetric distribution around a negative number, when actually we have an asymmetric distribution around zero. Okay, so Newmark and Vasher acknowledge the possibility of publication bias, but dismiss it on the grounds that, stay with me, I know this is a lot, they can reproduce the pattern of results in the literature by applying one test, then progressively extending that test to more data. As in, they make up a test of whether the minimum wage affects employment, then apply it again and again to different data sets. They argue that this method is not plagued by publication bias by design, since they're showing us every result on multiple case studies. However, using it does replicate the actual pattern of results in the literature. I cannot overstate how random this method is. It's not commonly accepted as disproof of publication bias anywhere. Every other paper uses a different method, most likely meta-analysis, which shows you whether the distribution of results has a weird or unexpected shape. Hello everyone. I appreciate that a lot of these debates to those outside of them can come across as a bit he said, she said, like there's just a back and forth, researchers disagree, but I really want to underscore that this Newmark and Vasher approach to meta-analysis is not commonly accepted, and I think the best way to do that is by using an exchange that only came to my attention since after recording this video. So there's an article from 2010 in the Journal of Economic Perspectives by a researcher called T.D. Stanley, who is an expert in meta-analysis. And it's not really about the minimum wage literature, it's mostly just a review of how to use meta-analysis. Stanley repeats some of the things I've said about being clear and consistent and specific with what papers you're including, what you're testing, and so on. He talks about some of the questions raised about meta-analysis, and he talks about some of its limitations and potential drawbacks and responds to some criticisms. Now, what's weird is that he really briefly mentions the minimum wage debate, and this prompted a response from Newmark and Vasher saying, why didn't you include our paper that had this method for testing whether publication bias exists or not? And essentially, Stanley's response was nothing short of withering. There are other good reasons for not citing Newmark and Vasher 1998. Their paper also exhibits a misunderstanding or disregard of meta-analysis. Newmark and Vasher refer to their paper as a meta-analysis. It is not. The paper does not draw on other studies at all. No objective researcher could possibly believe that using rolling regressions with a single model settles the question of whether publication bias exists across a rich empirical literature. When reviewing an empirical literature, many economists seem to become Bayesian, holding strong priors formed on the basis of theoretical considerations, as I wrote in my JEP article. All too often, believing is seeing. Researchers widely use meta-analysis, and Stanley's original article is a defense of this over subjective literature reviews like Newmark and Vasher's. They just don't engage with the way meta-analysis is used. The fact that some of their concerns, which may have a nub of validity, can be addressed with certain methods, which Stanley also details, as does the Wolfson and Bellman paper that I referenced earlier. So, all in all, this is just a paper and an approach that has disappeared. Nobody references this when talking about meta-analysis for anything, including the minimum wage. All of this is what economists sometimes call ad hoc. If you hear someone call your research ad hoc, you go home and cry. It's like a death sentence. And yeah, like much econo-speak, it gets thrown around too much, especially if work doesn't adhere to the mainstream. But this does, and I'm sorry, it's so ad hoc. One way of summarizing the Newmark and Vasher review is to say that it's contested. If you think it's just me, consider this quote by John Schmidt. He is a researcher on the minimum wage who has published multiple papers on the topic. Some of these found negative effects on employment, and Schmidt's papers are reviewed by Newmark and Vasher. Yet by 2013, Schmidt was concluding that the minimum wage had no discernible effect on employment, and wrote of their paper,
"The Newmark and Vasher review, however, is considerably more subjective and arguably less relevant to the United States than the two meta-studies discussed earlier. Only 52 of the 102 studies reviewed by Newmark and Vasher analyzed US data. Of these, Newmark and Vasher designated 19 as most credible, 5 of which were their own studies. The Newmark and Vasher 2006 review also excludes several important papers that were not published until after the review was completed, including the important contributions of Arindrajit Dube, William Lester, and Michael Reich, and Sylvia Allegretto, Dube, and Reich.
Instead of dwelling on the problems with their review any longer, I'm going to show you what I think is the appropriate way of addressing heterogeneity in minimum wage studies. You may disagree, and there are ongoing debates about the minimum wage that get way more involved than we can in this video. My point is to show you clearly and transparently why I believe what I believe. And why Sowell sucks. The modern minimum wage literature started with Card and Kruger's famous 1994 study. They compared the US state of New Jersey to neighboring Pennsylvania and found that, if anything, after hiking their minimum wage, New Jersey actually experienced a relative increase in employment when compared to Pennsylvania. This is clever because the states are so similar other than the increase in the minimum wage, and it took place over a small period of time, so trends and shifts may be small too. They didn't even look at the entire state. They looked at fast food restaurants physically close to the border between the states. So, same industry, same location, same time, different minimum wage laws. By making this comparison, they eliminate the most pressing concerns about heterogeneity without the need for fancy statistical analysis. It's controlled for by the environment in which the policy change happened. Hey, what's that noise? So loud. I already made a video about all of this. Future me, have you run out of ideas already? Well, no. There have only been like 10 more videos in the 3 years since that one, and I've still got loads of ideas. You know, you should really go on the offensive more instead of explaining yourself in other people's terms. Yes, that's what our therapist said. So, you should have put the immigration thing in the first version. That's what I'm doing now. Fuck you. And also, you pronounced the name Dubé wrong. And turn that music down. The immigration thing. Knew I should have done that. Sorry about that. Anyway, good critiques of Card and Kruger exist, and the literature has moved past their methods. But the study still serves as an excellent entry point into modern empirical research. It's just a really good study. It was so impactful not just because it changed our views on the minimum wage. It changed our view of labour markets. It changed empirical research in economics. And one of the great things about it is that it basically anticipates every objection thrown at it since it emerged, usually by people who haven't read it. Thomas Sowell does not directly reference Card and Kruger, but he indirectly does by critiquing their method. One common problem with some research on the employment effects of minimum wage laws is that surveys of employers before and after a minimum wage increase can survey only those particular businesses which survived in both periods. Given the high rates of business failures in many industries, the results for the surviving businesses may be completely different from the results for the industry as a whole. Using such research methods, you could survey people who have played Russian roulette and prove from their experiences that it is a harmless activity, since those for whom it was not harmless are unlikely to be around to be surveyed. Thus, you would have refuted the myth that Russian roulette is dangerous. Now, no lie, I found that last part about Russian roulette kind of fun and a good analogy for the point being made. This is known as survivorship bias. We only observe data on the businesses that survive, and that is a real and serious thing that we need to consider. But just like referencing a huge and contested review in passing, this is a strategy that I hate. Coming up with random on-the-fly methodological objections to studies you disagree with. You can always find such objections even for the best studies. Research is flawed. What you need to do is be clear and consistent about your method and why it is or is not being adhered to. It also helps if the objection actually applies to your intended target of criticism. Card and Kruger used surveys of employers, which makes me think Sowell is referencing them with his critique, along with the fact that they're so famous for their contrary minimum wage research. Also, in Discrimination and Disparities, he has basically the same discussion as in Basic Economics, but actually bothers to cite the paper. Here's the thing. They explicitly discuss survivorship bias.
We successfully followed nearly 100% of stores from a first wave of interviews conducted before the rise in the minimum wage, in February and March of 1992, to a second wave conducted 7 to 8 months after, in November and December of 1992. We have complete information on store closings and use the employment changes at the closed stores in our analyses. We can therefore measure the overall effect of the minimum wage on average employment, and not simply its effect on surviving establishments.
In other words, not many stores closed, and even the ones that did are accounted for by their analysis. Sowell's objection, therefore, has nothing to say about whether their research holds up. Economist Daniel Kuhn has contrasted two types of studies. Card-Kruger style ones match two appropriate geographic comparisons and are generally considered more sound for policy evaluation in modern economics. This accounts for heterogeneity by comparing cases that are as similar as possible except for the policy change. Job training, taxes, schools. Policy changes are evaluated using this method whether or not you're investigating the minimum wage. It's funny how much less contested these methods are for the less ideologically hot policies as well. More on that later. Alternative studies use high-level data on employment and wages and account for heterogeneity statistically. Most, though not all, of the studies that find minimum wages reduce employment follow this approach. Deere et al. Was one example, as are many in the 2006 Newmark and Vasher review. Sometimes statistically accounting for heterogeneity is all we can do with the data available to us. but I wouldn't set my watch to it.
There's a haircut you could set your watch to.
The main issue is that such studies just can't quite handle all of the heterogeneity in the neat way that the matching studies can. This table, produced by Kuhn, is originally from Dubé et al. The latter are highly regarded modern researchers on the minimum wage. The numbers are simply the effect of the minimum wage on employment. The negative effect of the minimum wage in the top row comes from an approach which neither controls for heterogeneity by matching similar counties, like New Jersey and Pennsylvania, nor by controlling for it statistically. They don't even bother. Going down the rows progressively controls for geographic differences using the statistical method. First, you account for different census divisions, which are large areas specified in US Census data: Northeast, South, Midwest, Northeast, Northwest, Northeast, Northeast, and Pacific. The effect becomes insignificant and falls hugely in magnitude. In the next row down, you control at a finer grained level, the level of states. Now the effect is positive but still insignificant. The next row controls for the Metropolitan Statistical Area, or MSA, which is even more fine-grained. The effect of the minimum wage on employment is still positive and statistically insignificant. The point is that as you go down the rows, you account for more and more of the heterogeneity between places, and the coefficient increases, turning from negative to positive, though remaining statistically insignificant outside the top row. The more you account for heterogeneity, the more it seems that the minimum wage doesn't really affect unemployment. But this table shows more. It shows how accounting for heterogeneity by controlling for geographic area turns the minimum wage increases unemployment in the top row into it has an uncertain effect in the bottom rows. However, we still haven't used our preferred method of matching Card and Kruger style. Dubé et al. Actually split their findings into two samples. One is just a sample with every possible county included, the one we just detailed in the left column. The other only includes the counties they were able to match as similar, which is in the right-hand column. You can see that even in this sample, if they don't use the right method to exploit the matched counties properly, they get a negative and significant effect of the minimum wage on employment at the top. It's like gathering data on the diets of twins and then forgetting that they're twins. You need to exploit that fact to benefit from it. I like this table because it explicitly illustrates the difference between the two methods. Once they do match the counties, right at the bottom, not only is the effect statistically insignificant, but it's very close to zero. This is a more convincing result. Having a precisely estimated zero effect is better than a large but insignificant one. It's the difference between saying the minimum wage could have any effect on employment and saying, actually, it's probably zero. This is why the meta-analysis from Dokoliagos and Stanley weighted the more precise estimates highly. Dubé's papers are the modern Neo-Card and Kruger, doing what they did, but across the entire USA with a wider range of minimum wage increases and finding that the effect is zero. So, what are you getting out of this, apart from the fact that I just love Card and Kruger? In summary, Sowell engages in crude cross-country comparisons which are easily belied by a handful of countries featuring high minimum wages and low unemployment. Relies on a 1995 short paper which isn't that well known and suffers from limitations that they partially acknowledge themselves. Throws out a survivorship bias argument which does not even apply to his intended target of criticism. Fails to explore the central question of how we can reliably evaluate the effects of policies, whether the minimum wage or otherwise. Fails to cite modern literature and widely accepted reviews and meta-analyses. Cites a 2006 literature review which is dated and one-sided. Man, it's so sad to review an old debate that you yourself participated in and conclude that you were right. Anyway, do you remember my Death of Economics 101 video? I was definitely right in that debate. The idea of supply and demand has permeated our culture so much that the brands it is meant to describe themselves reference it.
Sell me that pen. Watch. Go on.
Let me sell this fucking pen.
That's my boy right there.
This pen.
Fucking sell anything.
Why'd you do me a favor? Why'd you name down that napkin for me?
I don't have a pen.
Exactly. Supply and demand, my friend.
As with all ideas that filter into the collective consciousness, demand and supply has become so watered down that it means everything and nothing. Just like gaslighting, evolutionary, and Bayesian, which people say just to sound sophisticated. People who are not economists reference supply and demand in everyday conversation. It's just a meme. Supply and demand therefore means different things to different people. At its loosest, it is simply used to mean there is a buyer and a seller, a tautology which does not imply much about the effects of specific policies. It can be a decent starting point, especially since one person's spending is another person's income, but that's just accounting. It's consistent with a wide range of different theories about how the economy works. The next level up is using supply and demand to capture a few intuitions we know to be true. Yes, if a product is super popular and there isn't much of it, the price is likely to be high. Yes, if there is a massive influx of that product, the price will go down. Although in some cases, this is invoked as an excuse.
Now, how about a rose for the lady? $5 a pop.
I'll take one.
Oh, yeah? Well, I want one too.
$8.
But you just said...
Demand suddenly skyrocketed. You all saw it.
Then there is the basic theory, the famous scissors diagram featuring demand and supply curves. This is an introductory model from Economics 101 classes that predicts that the minimum wage will mechanically lead to an increase in unemployment. I went into detail on the model and its predictions in my original video, so I won't rehash it here. But this prediction of the model is well known. There is also a level beyond the basic theory. Many complex economic models do feature demand and supply curves, but they will not have the same policy implications as the basic model. In The Wolf of Wall Street, since Brad creates the demand for the pencil, this scenario is actually inconsistent with the basic model, which treats demand as fixed.
He's creating urgency. So you get them to want to buy the stuff. Convince them it's something that they need. You know what I mean?
And that's the thing. All nuns are lesbians.
What the fuck are you talking about?
When Thomas Sowell speaks about minimum wage laws, his view of the labour market is clearly in line with the basic version of supply and demand. He doesn't detail the mathematical model, but his reasoning follows its logic entirely. Just as we can better understand the economic role of prices in general when we see what happens when prices are not allowed to function, so we can better understand the economic role of workers' pay by seeing what happens when that pay is not allowed to vary with the supply and demand for labour. Like other markets, labour markets operate through demand and supply. In this case, the demand for labour is just a function of how productive it is. If labour is productive enough to warrant a given level of pay, then it will be employed at said level of pay. And the supply of labour depends on whether someone is willing to work for a given wage. If the wage is high enough to lure them out of bed, off benefits, or away from some other job, then they will work. Since this free interplay of supply and demand determines wage and employment rates across different industries, matching the right employees to the right employers for the right price, top-down legislation, which enforces alternative arrangements by fiat, is bound to fail. Minimum wage laws make it illegal to pay less than the government-specified price for labour. By the simplest and most basic economics, a price artificially raised tends to cause more to be supplied and less to be demanded than when prices are left to be determined by supply and demand in a free market. The result is a surplus, whether the price that is set artificially high is that of farm produce or labour. Making it illegal to pay less than a given amount doesn't make a worker's productivity worth that amount, and if not, that worker is unlikely to be employed. Suffice to say, this simplistic notion of demand and supply is nowhere near enough to understand the economy. The notion that you are paid your worth has a lot of appeal when, like Sowell, you want to paint the income distribution as natural and inevitable. It also has appeal when you are opposed to government interventions like the minimum wage. Finally, it has appeal for upholding a generally free market worldview. Am I suggesting that no credible studies find unemployment effects from the minimum wage? Absolutely not. But one thing is for sure, you're not going to learn much about it from reading Thomas Sowell. Well, yes, that, but also that this notion depends on assumptions which just do not hold, and modern labour economics recognises that fact. As the Ask Economics subreddit puts it,
the simplified Economics 101 is not the only way to view the labour market. It is absolutely true that in certain type of idealized situation, a minimum wage must lead to unemployment. However, that situation comes with many assumptions. The removal or changing of those assumptions would change the conclusions we come to.
The death of Econ 101 refers to something which has largely already happened inside academic economics. Over the past few decades, economists have gradually accepted that the minimum wage story is a little more complicated than the baseline theory implies. The standard demand-supply model predicts a mechanical increase in unemployment from a higher minimum wage, which is just not observed in practice. Not too long ago, prominent Labour economist Alan Manning called the effect of the minimum wage on unemployment elusive for this very reason. The profession was initially quite resistant to this finding. Nobel laureate James Buchanan was among those who dismissed the Card-and-Kruger paper on the basis that economic theory needed to be cracked.
The inverse relationship between quantity demanded and price is the core proposition in economic science, which embodies the presupposition that human choice behavior is sufficiently rational to allow predictions to be made. Just as no physicist would claim that water runs uphill, no self-respecting economist would claim that increases in the minimum wage increase employment. Such a claim, if seriously advanced, becomes equivalent to a denial that there even is minimal scientific content in economics, and that, in consequence, economists can do nothing but write as advocates for ideological interests. Fortunately, only a handful of economists are willing to throw over the teachings of 2 centuries. We have not yet become a bevy of camp-following whores.
Stay classy, James. Others, though seeming to accept the findings, expressed astonishment at them, as if a physical law had been violated. Reed Garfield, senior economist of the Joint Economic Committee, commented in 1996,
"The results of the study were extraordinary. Card and Kruger seemed to have discovered a refutation of the law of demand. Economists were stunned. Because of these extraordinary results, they debated the results. Many economists argue that differences between the states were more than simply differences of minimum wage rates. Other economists argued that the study design was flawed."
David Card reported that he lost a lot of friends because of the result.
"I've subsequently stayed away from the minimum wage literature for a number of reasons. First, it cost me a lot of friends. People that I had known for many years, for instance, some of the ones I met at my first job at the University of Chicago, became very angry or disappointed. They thought that in publishing our work we were being traitors to the cause of economics as a whole."
Pathetic, isn't it? Views on the issue change gradually, and nowadays, economists have mixed opinions on the minimum wage. Most would probably answer a question like, does the minimum wage cause unemployment with, not really, but it depends. Which is the correct attitude to almost every economic policy, and one I was hoping to promote in my video. By the 2000s, most younger economists probably accepted all this, but introductory or 101 classes typically lag behind the frontier of the profession, and following the 2008 financial crisis, there was renewed concern over their content. Among the problems was whether the centering of the classic demand and supply diagram, which was still an important part of classes, leaned students too much towards free market policy conclusions on shaky grounds. More generally, the excessive focus on deriving theoretical results distracted from modern empirical techniques like those pioneered by Card and Kruger. The movement to change economics education, which I've long been a part of, birthed things like the core curriculum, which has taken over the world in the past decade and centers historical context and evidence over abstract theory, though it still uses some modeling. Raj Shetty took over the famous introductory course at Harvard from Greg Mankiw with the ostensible aim of making economics more data-driven and less focused on these theories. Shetty is the same one who has produced the comprehensive social mobility data that we saw earlier. In other words, the curriculum has only recently truly caught up with these developments due to professional inertia. One article documented,
Mankiw's discussion of the minimum wage, for instance, heavily emphasizes the idea that the minimum wage causes unemployment. If the government doesn't intervene, the wage normally adjusts to balance labor supply and labor demand. He writes, introducing the below graphic, which concludes, the result of the minimum wage is unemployment.
Unfortunately, economics on the internet has not yet caught up. For all their flaws, actual Econ 101 courses probably never fit the stereotype of being free market havens outside a few places like Chicago. They definitely focus too much on the standard model, and the hold supply and demand has on the discipline persists even now. But when economics is transplanted into the public arena, it becomes much more rigid and dogmatic, thanks to people like Thomas Sowell. Adherence to this idea is a vision of the world that people are committed to for reasons beyond the policy itself. Do you think people actually care that much about the minimum wage? It's a policy which affects relatively few people, mainly teenagers who will move out of low-paid employment over their life cycle. Most people are unaffected by it because, by definition, it only applies at the bottom of the wage distribution. Those classic blue-collar manufacturing workers who have been experiencing decline, they were never earning at the minimum wage and wouldn't even be much affected by a $15 one in the USA. I support it, but it is far from my number one policy because it's not that significant for most people. Most importantly, it doesn't affect non-workers like children, the chronically sick, retired people, or homemakers, at least not directly. I'm not going to do a Sowell here and deny my viewpoint. Our understanding of these things does have a relationship with our politics. I obviously have a progressive bent. I've long thought that a $15 minimum wage in the USA would be a good thing, partially because the simplistic minimum wage equals unemployment view propagated by people like Sowell doesn't stand up to scrutiny. I do think that in some instances, poorer locations and industries with tight profit margins, employment might go down. Whether this is offset by boosts in other places is hard to say. Overall, the fact that $15 was a good political slogan, plus the evidence for modest negative effects at worst, makes it a pretty good policy. I could get into a flame war with the responses to my video, but I'll just say this. Actually, I will get into a flame war because it has been drawn to my attention that one of the people who made a response video to me, which as far as I recall called me stupid, turned out to be a groomer and has since had to delete their YouTube channel. So there you go, mate. I'd rather be stupid than an actual file. As per usual, people on the internet fail to understand specific arguments. The point of my Economics 101 video was not that we should have a $50 minimum wage. It was that if somebody says you can't raise the minimum wage because of supply and demand or basic economics, they do not understand economics. Actually understanding economic theory and evidence beyond so-called Econ 101 will lead you to the conclusion that, at the very least, minimum wages are hardly catastrophic for unemployment. But mea culpa. Perhaps I didn't hammer this home enough in that video. So let me engage in overkill with more examples. Thomas Sowell on immigration, race, and culture. What the fuck? Sowell has some things to say about immigration that, at first glance, would seem to conflict with a lot of his views. Firstly, he believes in the American dream, which, to my mind, includes the Statue of Liberty inscription.
Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, the tempest tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. I'm walking here.
Secondly, he is extremely pro-market and anti-government intervention. What is more pro-market than allowing labour, people, to move freely across the world? To be allocated to where it is most productive, for those in the globe who live in extreme poverty to locate themselves in an environment where they can escape that poverty in the only possible way known to man, according to Sowell, by working. To let the supply and demand of labour run wild and untamed. Remember that Sowell's economic writings are, by and large, consequentialist. To prove that immigration is a bad thing, he'd have to show that it produces negative outcomes. He dedicates an entire chapter to immigration in his book, Applied Economics, including economic arguments, but mostly focusing on culture. His main contention is that immigration entails a number of social costs to the native population that must be considered. He calls the immediate impact of policies like immigration Stage 1 thinking, and the latter considerations Stage 2 thinking. There's some interesting data in this chapter about the basic contours of immigration, who goes where, how often people return to their country of origin, the fact that as of 2007, only 3% of the world were immigrants, despite all of the massive debates about it. Even though they're only a small percentage of the population, the size of remittances from immigrants is often a sizable percentage of national income in poorer countries, 20% in Jordan and 25% in Haiti. These basic but arresting facts are the kind of thing that's easy to overlook in heated discussions about immigration, and Sowell summarizes them well. With that said, this chapter is genuinely the most biased and poorly sourced thing I've ever read by Sowell, maybe by anyone. It's not even about economics, it's mostly a run-of-the-mill rant about immigrants, which focuses on crime, terrorism, and their generally ungrateful attitude. I tried to stay analytical and open-minded, but I lost professional composure reading this chapter. You think I'm exaggerating? Cultural assimilation has been held back by the multicultural idea of accommodating and perpetuating group differences instead of seeking social cohesion by drawing various segments of the population into the common culture of the country. In Britain, for example, there are more than 100 ethnic support groups, ranging from an Afro-Caribbean lunch club to a forum for Chinese diabetics just in Liverpool. And swimming pools in most big towns have women-only nights, aimed mainly at tempting modest Muslims into the water, according to The Economist. Individually and in the short run, many of these things may be benign, but thinking beyond stage one, this could mean freezing social divisions at the expense of the social cohesion required to sustain a society. Fucking Afro-Caribbean lunch clubs jeopardizing social cohesion. Honestly. But Brexit might not have happened if it weren't for those damned Chinese diabetic groups. This chapter is so ranty that Sowell even contradicts himself. He first quotes The Economist as highlighting the fact that many immigrants do jobs natives do not want to do. Advertise for a cleaner in London at twice the minimum hourly wage and you will get no response from local school dropouts or Liverpool's unemployed. More probably, the applicants will be from Ukraine, Colombia, or Poland. Weirdly, the context here is a point about European welfare states being too generous, which isn't even linked to the quote, but Sowell seems to be quoting it approvingly nonetheless. Yet, in his conclusion to the chapter, he states, among the things that politicians say that economics can challenge is the oft-repeated claim that immigrants take jobs that citizens of the country will not take. That can be challenged both empirically and analytically. In the United States, for example, there are no major sectors of the economy in which even half the workers are immigrants. So, immigrants take jobs natives don't want, but also economists know that they don't do that. What the fuck is going on? Sowell isn't usually this incoherent. Sowell's substantive contribution in this chapter is that there is no such thing as an immigrant. The effects of immigration will vary with the source country, the destination country, and the time. Germans migrating to the US are going to have a different impact to Lebanese people doing so. Even Germans migrating to Brazil are going to have a different impact to Germans migrating to the US. What this means more broadly is that there is little point in trying to analyse or set legal policies for immigrants in general, because there are no immigrants in general. This is a fair point and is worth highlighting analytically, yet Sowell uses this insight as an excuse to rant about Muslims. Among Muslims in the United States, a poll by the Pew Research Center found that 1 out of 4 respondents under the age of 30 accepted suicide bombing. Let's check the source then. This is a 2009 article called Muslim Melting Pot in the Wall Street Journal. It is written by Irshad Manji, and early on it does state,
Muslim Americans, released by the Pew Research Center, contains moments of bad news. For example, 1 in 4 respondents under the age of 30 accepts suicide bombing.
Let's check that source then. This polling report is called Muslim Americans, Middle Class and Mostly Mainstream. As the title suggests, it's not about how Muslims cannot integrate. It finds that the vast majority of Muslims do not support suicide bombing. 78% say that it is never justified. It also finds that 15% of Muslims under 30 say it can often, 2%, or sometimes 13% be justified. That's not 1 in 4. 1 in 4 is 25%. This is 1 in 6 or 7. Manji gets the figure wrong and Sowell repeats it without checking her source. Going back to Manji's Wall Street Journal article, it's quite optimistic. She opens with disappointment at the minority of young Muslims who think suicide bombing can be justified, but goes on to discuss that most are doing well, are happy to be in the USA, plus how to address the barriers they face, including discrimination. She proclaims,
a common aspiration such as the American dream is crucial to giving Muslims a sense of belonging to something larger and more dynamic than cultural enclaves.
Put a pin in that. The point about Muslims is one of Sowell's major arguments against second-generation immigrants. Yet, in other ways, the second generation may adjust less readily to American society than did the immigrant generation. Those who had fled either poverty or oppression in their native lands tended to be keenly aware of the advantages of living in American society. But their children, who never experienced the life that their parents lived in other countries, may tend to compare their lot with that of other Americans around them, and often develop resentments and bitterness at their own lower economic or social status. Interestingly, the young Muslims polled about suicide bombing aren't necessarily second generation, so this doesn't even support his point narrowly. Now, I could go through every culture war point he makes like this. It's full of random, cherry-picked culture war anecdotes. Didn't you know Mexican immigrants booed the US soccer team? Ha! Good thing natives never do that.
Nice to see your home fans boo you. That's what we're supporting.
What's important is why Sowell starts talking about second-generation immigrants at all. The answer is that he's burying the lead that first-generation immigrants simply do not commit crimes. They have a much lower offence and incarceration rate than natives, and this is a common finding. In fact, research suggests that when second-generation immigrants commit more crimes than their parents, they are just aligning with the natives. Plus, second-generation immigrants have higher levels of education and earn more, which is not mentioned by Sowell, even though it is in the same Economist article that he cited earlier. Luckily, I didn't check that source anymore because I'm running out of substances. Plus, if you're born somewhere, aren't you a native? This is all just a big moving of the goalposts.
Both my parents were born in Mexico. Oh, yeah. And they moved to the United States a year before I was born.
Yeah.
So I grew up in the United States.
Wow, that is a great story. That's the American dream right there.
Immigrants are often the best behaved citizens, and second generation immigrants are born in that country. Instead of dwelling on crime, which is a complex issue in itself, I want to get to the economics of this. Given that's what my channel and Sowell's books are ostensibly about, plus it helps us learn more about the Death of Economics 101. Aside from whatever the hell Sowell is doing with all of this cultural commentary, he has an extremely shallow and short section on the economics of immigration. In a book called Applied Economics, Sowell does a more advanced approach. He barely touches the literature on the subject. His entire view can be summed up by this lengthy quote. Considering the strong evidence on the effect of massive 19th century European emigration in narrowing the gap between wages in Europe and wages in the countries to which Europeans were immigrating, it might be expected that there would be similarly clear evidence on the effect of contemporary immigration to the United States on either the incomes or unemployment rates of American workers in general or low-income workers in particular. But here, again, studies have reached conflicting results. Part of the problem in this case is that many of the studies have been local area studies in places with large concentrations of immigrants. While workers in those particular areas may not be much affected, if ample supplies of immigrant workers have kept wages low in a particular area, that provides an incentive for American workers in similar occupations to avoid moving to such areas or to leave such areas if they lived there before. Echoing his approach to the minimum wage, Sowell articulates a plausible issue with investigating the effects of immigration, but does not cite or engage with the relevant literature beyond this potential objection. The go-to study here is David Card. Yes, the same one as the minimum wage. Believe me when I tell you these guys completely changed economics and that Sowell is lagging behind, to say the least. Sowell's implication is that people are comparing the wages of immigrants and native-born workers at a point in time and finding low wage differentials, then concluding immigrants have no impact. In fact, studies are way beyond this. They are looking at how wages change after new immigrants arrive and comparing this across different cities. Card himself literally begins by noting Sowell's objection.
Immigrants tend to move to cities where the growth in demand for labour can accommodate their supply, even if new immigrants cluster in only a few cities, as they do in the United States. Inter-city migration of natives will tend to offset the adverse effects of immigration. These considerations illustrate the difficulty of using the correlation across cities between wages and immigrant densities to measure the effect of immigration on the labour market opportunities of natives.
Again, Sowell somehow missed this famous study and all of the crucial things it tells us about how to understand immigration. David Card was able to address this in 1990 with publicly available data. How did Card approach this? As background, there was a sudden influx of Cuban immigrants to Miami as a result of Castro's one-off permission to emigrate in 1980. In an event called the Mariel Boat Lift, around 125,000 Cubans took the journey between May and September of that year. This increased Miami's labor force by a whopping 7% and its Cuban labor force by 20%. Despite this, Card found it had virtually no impact on wages or unemployment among existing low-paid, low-skilled workers. He finds this by comparing Miami to other, similar cities which did not receive an influx of immigrants, kind of like his approach to the minimum wage, albeit not as fine-grained. Card himself suggests that Miami is unique in being able to absorb Cubans, given the pre-existing presence of immigrants there and the long-standing links between the two places.
In America, first you get the sugar, then you'll get the power, then you'll get the women.
We can be charitable to Sowell, though. Card also finds that American workers probably moved to Miami at a lower rate following the Mariel Boat Lift. This isn't quite what Sowell was saying, as he isn't looking at changes, just wage differences at a single point in time, but it is in the spirit of what he says. What if opportunities for immigrants means fewer opportunities for natives? Well, Card also has a 2001 paper which finds that this is probably the case, but the effects are pretty small. Sowell's approach of picking out one potential issue with the data fails to recognize how significant the problem actually is. It might be real, but, as in this case, small in magnitude. And the headline finding is simply that immigration doesn't really affect natives, which Sowell doesn't mention. In a book about economics, the section on the economics of immigration is only a few paragraphs long. There is no engagement with the vast number of economic studies on the topic, or any clue what modern thinking believes. For instance, a valuable review by David Rudman from 2014, the same year as the 5th edition of Basic Economics and 2 years before the 2nd edition of Applied Economics, the more advanced follow-up, sums things up nicely.
The debate over the economic impacts of immigration can be seen as a battle between metaphors. Is an economy like a pie, with a set number of jobs, so that one person's employment gain is another's loss? Or is it like a church congregation, which one person can join to experience communion and fellowship without costing anyone else the same? To a first approximation, the answer is clear, the latter. In wealthy nations, at least, jobs and labour earnings are not in rigidly fixed supply. Jobs are relationships of exchange, forming and disintegrating every day. Like other relationships, their absolute number can expand with population. The arrival of new workers creates new possibilities for production even as it increases consumer demand for goods and services. Wealthy nations are wealthy precisely because of the ability to squeeze value out of available resources, including human talent.
It's just dishonest, dare I say ignorant, not to place this comprehensively studied issue front and centre. Instead, Sowell spends most of his time trying to find costs of immigration, whatever they may be. More fundamentally, immigrants bring both benefits and costs to the countries they enter, creating the classic economic problem of trade-offs. In addition, these benefits and costs vary greatly from one group of immigrants to another. For example, in the early 21st century, 45% of the immigrants from Asia had a college degree compared to just 4% among immigrants from Mexico. Notice that whether or not immigrants have a degree doesn't actually tell us much about their impact. What if the host country needs unskilled workers? This what if turns out to be pretty important. As Sowell reminds us, distinguishing between different groups is necessary to get the full picture. As Sowell doesn't remind us, this leads to estimates of the economic impact of immigration on natives to be small at worst. As Rudman puts it, immigrants may work in the kitchen, while natives will work at the front of the restaurant. One of the most innovative papers on the issue of whether immigrants and natives take different jobs was by Michael A. Clemens, who used a policy which tried to give priority to US citizens in farm jobs traditionally given to immigrants. He found that even during the Great Recession, and even with employers obliged to pursue them, native workers were unlikely to apply for these jobs. There are myriad long-term benefits to immigration that Sowell also ignores. Over time, Rudman emphasizes that they will become consumers as well as workers, start businesses, save and invest, complement existing workers, and generally expand the size of the economy. Ironically, the group most negatively affected by immigration are recent immigrants from the same country. But even those effects are small. We're talking a couple of % of relative decline in wages, and they are short-term. Rudman concludes that over the long term, a wide range of balanced immigration will benefit everyone. The economic case against immigration is not a strong one, and besides, Sowell barely even touches the major issues in modern economics. The cultural case that Sowell makes is less coherent and factual than most of his writing, which is saying a lot. But there's another issue here which goes back to Econ 101. Here is Sowell cautioning against simplicity in the context of immigration. Like history, economics cannot be invoked thoughtlessly, without regard to the specifics of the time and place. In the abstract, the free movement of people, like the free movement of goods and services, promotes economic benefits when there are willing participants ready to transact on mutually agreeable terms, unimpeded by a national boundary. But the movement of people from country to country has different consequences from the movement of goods and services. When Americans buy a Toyota from Japan, the Toyota does not demand that the United States accommodate the Japanese language or that Americans adjust themselves to Japanese customs in their own country, much less introduce diseases into the American population. Moreover, Toyotas do not give birth to little Toyotas that can grow up with the problematic attitudes of some second-generation immigrants. Okay, so first, cute image with the Toyotas. Kudos. I put this into an AI art generator thinking the results would be cute and... Also, yes, economics cannot be invoked thoughtlessly without regard to the specifics of time and place. Weirdly, this is in tension with something that he said at the start of Basic Economics about economics being a set of laws that applies everywhere, but whatever. I'm going to put forward a proposition. What if there were a group of people who had certain tendencies that meant that most of the simple Econ 101 stories, and even some of the more advanced ones, didn't play out? Like, some kind of cultural tendencies that affected our economics in the same way that Sowell thinks the culture of immigrants affects our conclusions about the economics of immigration. Except, what if this group of people, this culture of people, were called humans? You see, when it comes to immigration, Sowell is willing to balance economic considerations with other potential harms that lie outside of simple supply and demand. But when it comes to the minimum wage, he doubles down on that story. Attempts to make prices, including the prices of people's labour and talents, be something other than signals to guide resources to their most valued uses, make those prices less effective for their basic purpose, on which the prosperity of the whole society depends. Ultimately, it is economic prosperity which makes it possible for billions of dollars to be devoted to helping the less fortunate. I said this last time. I don't think that Sowell is against all help for the poor and all interventions into the labour market, but he hardly gives these ideas the space they're due, especially when compared to the amount of time he spends making frankly racist comments about immigrants. To be fair, he does caution against blaming immigrants, as he did with the poor, as opposed to just evaluating the effects of immigration. Nevertheless, a one-sided focus on their negative impact is going to lead to the same conclusions, and when the evidence is this incomplete and anecdotal and wrong, it's nothing short of a lie. Beyond just poor analysis, those who critique the minimum wage or looser immigration as policies are simultaneously defending the standard model of demand and supply. Newmark and Vasher repeatedly declare their commitment to the standard competitive model, though in a 184-page literature review it might have been nice for them to, actually detail it and specify what it predicts. Even the Deere paper cited by Sowell, remember, insisted that its results did not contradict the law of demand. One paper by economist George Borjas, insisting that immigration lowered wages, had the telling title, "The Labour Demand Curve is Downward Sloping." Card himself acknowledged that the model seems to imply that, as a theoretical matter, immigration has to lower the wages of natives. Standard demand and supply logic would imply that an increase in the supply of labour led to a decline in wages. Empirically, the average impact on wages is around zero. Standard demand and supply logic would imply that setting a substantial minimum wage would reduce employment. Empirically, the average impact on employment is around zero. This goes back to a word I was emphasising with the minimum wage literature: heterogeneity. Sure, some of our basic intuitions about supply and demand hold in certain isolated scenarios, but there are so many differences between locations, workers, products, industries, and individual businesses that they only identify one force which may be overwhelmed by all the heterogeneity in the real world. There are just so many things the glib supply and demand model doesn't capture. David Card's reflections on the minimum wage say it all.
What we were trying to do in our research was use the minimum wage as a lever to gain more understanding of how labour markets actually work and, in particular, to address a question that we thought was quite important. To what extent does the simplest model of supply and demand actually describe how employers operate in the labour market?
The answer, known by almost every economist, is that it does not. It does not work for the minimum wage, and it does not work for immigration. It does not work for job training programs, and it does not work for taxes. It does not work for inequality and mobility, nor for discrimination. You need a holistic view that includes history, culture, politics, as well as an up-to-date view of quantitative empirical evidence and of the more advanced models of the labour market used by contemporary economists, not to mention other perspectives like Marxist economics. This is a basic point that would barely be worth mentioning to practicing economists, but out in the wild, in popular economics books, and especially on the internet, it is apparently the most radical thing you can say. Thomas Sowell accepts the death of Economics 101 for immigration, but not for anything else. Hey, FD, how you doing? Yeah, I just wanted to talk to you because I'm filming my second video about Thomas Sowell, and the issue of discrimination and race has come up. Now, this means that there are a lot of historical articles and books about African American history, and these typically use the word Negro quite liberally. I was wondering what you thought about saying this when I have to.
Hey, so the quick and obvious answer is that no serious person would take issue with the uses of that term under this context. However, as I'm sure you know, YouTube comment sections are full of unserious people, whether it be the performatively progressive white viewers looking to show how progressive they are by finding something problematic to implicate in you, or possibly more likely bad faith right wingers looking to critique you in bad faith for using a term that might be deemed offensive as a way to not engage with the merits of your argument, especially with Thomas Sowell. Anyway, for a bit of context, the term Negro was originally the term from Spanish and Portuguese colonials who, as we know, were the first to really start to spread the curse of European imperialism around the world. It essentially means black, and it comes from the Latin word niger, which also means black. And as you start to hear this history, you understand why it's a term that fell out of popularity post the civil rights movement. And this happened in the more radical black power movement that came after the civil rights movement from Stokely Carmichael, aka Kwame Ture, and America's participation in Pan-Africanism, which is spearheaded by Du Bois. And a lot of stuff that I know people don't care about. All y'all care about is this a bad word to say? Yes, but not in this context. If you really care, please don't just take my word for it. Do the knowledge yourself. I'll shoot you a quick article to put in the description. Peace and blessings.
Okay. The Negro today is like the immigrant yesterday. Or so says the title of a famous 1966 New York Times article by Irving Kristol. Kristol argues that many of the social problems created by mass movements of people are real, especially when there are cultural differences that cause clashes. David Card documented that following the Mariel boat lift, there was a spike in crime and there were riots. Assimilation or simply learning to live together takes time. This doesn't place the blame on the immigrants alone, far from it, but it acknowledges a genuine social challenge. And the fact of African American history is not just the abolition of slavery and segregation where they stood, but the accompanying movement from plantations in the South into cities, largely in the North. As Kristol is pointing out, this is why their experience rhymes with the experience of European immigrants past. That includes their complex exposure to discrimination. Thomas Sowell's main argument against the prevalence of discrimination is that many disparities can be explained by things other than discrimination. Disparities can arise due to factors from luck to cultural traits to seemingly trivial demographic variables like age. You may recall Sowell using age to explain income inequality in general. Income rises over someone's working life, so a senior banker earns more than a teenager at McDonald's. He argues that African Americans are generally younger than other demographic groups, and this may explain average disparities in earnings. I think this is kind of interesting. I mean, we may want to ask why the age disparity exists between the two demographics, on top of the piggy bank redistribution questions we raised earlier. But I still found myself interested in Sowell's discussion of age and demographics. It is at least a point worth making. Once more though, to act like he's the only one not making these errors, Sowell has to misrepresent sources, misunderstand important arguments, and omit the best research on the topic. The simple fact is that academics are well beyond just looking at disparities alone as evidence for discrimination, as are journalists. Sowell begins by arguing that prejudice actually means prejudgment, which implies that the judgment is made from a position of ignorance. He states that adverse opinions about racial and ethnic groups may instead have some basis in reality. He quotes the famous sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois to make his point.
So heads up, I do say Du Bois instead of Du Bois throughout this whole section.
Even when favourable or unfavourable judgments about groups are based on knowledge, judgments of particular individuals from within these groups may be made on the basis of prejudice. As W.E.B. Du Bois pointed out about the hiring of blacks in the 19th century, the individual black workman is rated not by his own efficiency, but by the efficiency of a whole group of black fellow workmen, which may often be low. Therefore, even if white people were to lose their racial prejudices overnight, he said, this would make very little immediate difference to the economic condition of most blacks. According to Du Bois, writing in 1898, some few would be promoted, some few would get new places, but the masses would remain as they are until the younger generation began to improve in response to greater job opportunities due to reduced racial barriers. Let's check the source then.
Hey everyone, you may have noticed that there is some of that stuff on my face, which obviously wasn't actually glue. Also, my nose is red, and that's because I had to re-record this clip after I had also sniffed some stuff for a later clip. So yeah, I'm just fucked. Just shot to pieces here. Sorry.
The essay is called The Philadelphia Negro. It is a detailed account of the difficulties that African Americans faced in Philadelphia in the late 19th century following the abolition of slavery and their migration to the city. It details the various barriers faced by black people at the time, including in employment, social interaction, family life, and as consumers. This created innumerable social problems in the cities, as Chris Stoll would echo 70 years later. The vast majority of the essay is about how important it is to bring down these barriers, and Du Bois lays the blame almost solely at the feet of the white race. It's tempting to state the obvious. Sowell is largely playing down discrimination while Du Bois is playing it up. It's kind of jarring that Sowell quotes someone so well known for campaigning against discrimination to make the opposite argument to them. It's also a little bit clever. Sowell is making a narrow point here, and actually I wouldn't accuse him of misrepresenting Du Bois, even though they obviously disagree. Sowell continues. Du Bois saw white employers' adverse judgments of black workers at that time as being generally accurate, though not accurate as regards all individual black workers currently or the potential of black workers in the future. Whatever the empirical validity of his assessments, what is relevant here is that he made the crucial analytical distinction between adverse judgments based on experience and unsubstantiated prejudgments. Moreover, while the lumping together of disparate members of a group can explain why particular individuals from that group earn less than comparable individuals from other groups, such individual disparities cannot explain group disparities. For that, the generalization about the group's performance as a whole must be erroneous. Seldom is any serious effort made to demonstrate such group-wide errors. More often, the simple fact that an adverse generalization has been made about a group is taken as itself evidence of prejudice, and the underrating of particular individuals from that group is taken as proof. The point on which this whole argument hinges is Sowell's analytical distinction between adverse judgments based on experience and unsubstantiated prejudgments. He calls the former discrimination type 1 and the latter discrimination type 2. The implication is that the former is more justified because it's the reality. If hiring someone creates adverse outcomes, it's reasonable to avoid it. If it doesn't create adverse outcomes, then it's pure prejudice or discrimination too. I want to argue that while this may be worthwhile as an academic distinction, as a practical matter, it tends to miss the historical dynamics of discrimination and prejudice. I have to admit that this is the first time I found Sowell wrong in an interesting way. But wrong he is. Let me illustrate the point with an example more in line with my own lived experience. Downton Abbey is set in the early 20th century, and it shows the remnants of the British aristocracy as they are forced to adapt to change. Change like technology.
Is this an instrument of communication or torture?
Commerce.
Can't we allow things to evolve more gently as we did in the past? The past is not much of a model. The third Earl nearly went bankrupt.
Political change.
What worries me is that our government is committed to the destruction of people like us and everything we stand for.
And of course...
Who is this singer and how did he get here? Isn't it rather odd?
The patriarch Robert Crawley seems an amicable man on the surface, but he holds many of the prejudices of his era, and this comes out quite strongly when they're challenged. It's made clear early on that he doesn't think women should be involved in certain areas of life.
We must have a care for feminine sensibilities. They are finer and more fragile than our own.
As the 20th century progresses, Robert's daughters and wife begin to take part in activities that he believes are unsuited to them, with the result that he becomes less amicable and more angry. At one point, his wife Cora visits an art gallery in London with an expert, and she seems to have an aptitude for it.
Even the magpie seems to have been struck dumb.
You're very sharp.
Robert's comments on the matter show, however, that he simply does not believe that this is possible.
That an art expert would find your observations on the work of Piero della Francesca impossible to resist. Yes, it is hard to believe.
To be fair, Robert has travelled down to London from Yorkshire, where Downton Abbey is located, to surprise Cora. He finds she has been out at an art gallery with another man, so it's fair for him to be angry. But that doesn't excuse his prejudice, and this isn't his first rodeo. When his daughter Mary tries to get more involved in the commercial management of the estate, he says this.
In fact, there's a question of using empty farmyards as new sources of revenue. I'd like to know what you feel about that.
Well, I'd have to think about it.
Crop rotation, livestock versus cereals, or indeed the whole matter of the tax. There are lots of things I would like your opinion on.
My point here, other than the fact that I love Downton Abbey and will probably make a whole video about how it explains capitalism one day, is that Robert's prejudice is in line with this idea put forward by Sowell. That is, what he's saying is factually true. Mary does not know much about land management, and Cora does not know much about art, even if she has potential. But Robert is using these facts to foreclose the possibility that the women might participate and learn. The historical fact of their exclusion and subsequent ignorance becomes the excuse for him to discriminate, even though the only way they will escape that ignorance is to take part. It's actually irrelevant that they don't know much as him, except as a responsibility that he and others have to teach them more. This is precisely what Sowell misses, but Du Bois doesn't. Du Bois' central point is that prejudice concerns the potential of African Americans, a word Sowell mentions but glosses over. To recall, he says, Du Bois saw white employers' adverse judgments of black workers at that time as being generally accurate, though not accurate as regards all individual black workers currently or the potential of black workers in the future. He'd have done better to treat the potential as the main point. The interaction between the fact of inferiority and the expectations is important, even though Sowell treats them as distinct. The discrimination is what keeps the group judgment true, as Du Bois emphasizes repeatedly.
Men are used to seeing Negroes in inferior positions. When, therefore, by any chance a Negro gets in a better position, most men immediately conclude that he is not fitted for it, even before he has a chance to show his fitness.
At this point, the language in Du Bois' essay starts to get a little tastier. He uses the actual word. Hey, FD, can I...
You get one. You only get one.
Loud and clear. Being from 1898, Du Bois is too harsh for our sensibilities today. He is himself probably guilty of overstating the deficiencies of the black community. I think he's being rhetorical too when he says that abolishing prejudice overnight would have little effect. That's a reach. But with him, you get a sense of being tough but fair, of believing that people can do better if they are no longer discriminated against and are able to take responsibility for their own destinies. This process isn't automatic. Du Bois' essay is a rallying call for African Americans to build themselves up, so long as they are permitted to do so. He's saying, once the boot gets off our backs, we will, and we must, prove ourselves. With Sowell, the toughness is there, but the sympathy, the understanding, and the inspiration are not. There is no boot. Toughen up. And this is funny because at times Du Bois sounds more small c conservative than Sowell.
The difference is that he retains a focus on racism.
It is the atmosphere of rebellion and discontent that unrewarded merit and reasonable but unsatisfied ambition make. The social environment of excuse, listless despair, careless indulgence, and lack of inspiration to work is the growing force that turns black boys and girls into gamblers, prostitutes, and rascals. And this social environment has been built up slowly out of the disappointments of deserving men and the sloth of the unawakened. How long can a city say to a part of its citizens, "It is useless to work. It is fruitless to deserve well of men. Education will gain you nothing but disappointment and humiliation"?
100 years after Du Bois wrote, economists managed to catch up and backed up his contentions with some of the best research in social science, the CV studies. I've referenced these before on my channel in the context of gender discrimination, but they apply just as much to ethnicity. They sent out CVs which are identical in all but name, so the experimenter could manipulate the perceived characteristic of interest via the name, while leaving everything else about the applicants constant. A bit like comparing two neighbouring counties. Comparing two almost identical CVs eliminates most sources of heterogeneity, including all the ones that Sowell is worried about. One of the original CV studies investigated discrimination against African Americans and was aptly titled, "Are Emily and Greg More Employable than Lakeisha and Jamal?" The CVs were split not only between those who were black and white, but also by quality. Some had more experience, more qualifications, more soft skills like knowing a foreign language, fewer holes in their employment history, and so on. The researchers could therefore investigate 4 groups: white and qualified, black and qualified, white and unqualified, and black and unqualified. The study found that Lakeisha and Jamal were in fact 1/3 less likely to get the callback than Emily and Greg, even with identical CVs. But the quality element of the study revealed a concerning nuance. While white people with a high-quality CV were more likely to get an offer than white people with a low-quality CV, for black people, this factor didn't make a difference at all. African Americans with lots of experience and skills were treated the same as those without. In the words of economist Tim Harford,
"It was as though there were 3 categories: gifted and white, ordinary and white, and simply black."
The message from this finding is quite clear. Why try to escape poverty via education when it won't make a difference? This is exactly what Du Bois was talking about. This is exactly how Robert tried to thwart Mary and Cora's efforts in Downton Abbey. The study is a little old now, although no older than most of Sowell's references, but a guide was released by one of its authors, Marion Bertrand, along with Esther Duflo in 2017. 1 year before Sowell's book Discrimination and Disparities was published. They review studies done across different countries and consistently find that black people are discriminated against in employment. They also find that other ethnic minorities are disfavoured compared to white people, and that immigrants are disfavoured when compared to natives. Now, what does Sowell have to say about these robust, well-known studies illustrating without a shadow of a doubt that both non-white and non-native people are heavily discriminated against? In basic economics, there is a short section on discrimination. Sowell blames minimum wages for persistent discrimination. In a market where wages are set artificially above the level that would exist through supply and demand, the resulting surplus of job applicants can mean that discrimination costs the employer nothing, since there would be no delay in filling the job under these conditions. Then the section ends. By the way, modern evidence indicates that the minimum wage reduces racial inequality. In applied economics, the more advanced follow-up, there is a whole chapter on discrimination. Sowell states that black people can't be racist to other black people based on an example he made up. Is it just racial prejudice which causes black taxi drivers in New York to avoid picking up black male passengers at night? Then the chapter ends. Black people can indeed discriminate against black people. There's a whole debate about whether black-owned banks are more likely to reject black applicants than white-owned banks, but none of the studies show that they are less likely. In Discrimination and Disparities, Sowell devotes a whole book to the topic. He says that we should formally test discrimination as a hypothesis. Discrimination as an explanation of economic and social disparities may have a similar emotional appeal for many, but we can at least try to treat these and alternative theories as testable hypotheses. Then the book ends. That's right. Across 3 books, Sowell has not engaged with these studies at all. I searched the citations, it's not there, despite the fact that they most clearly show a disparity that can only arise from discrimination. This is especially galling since Sowell is seemingly so concerned with actually testing the discrimination hypothesis, yet fails to note the famous studies that most directly test the discrimination hypothesis. Sowell does have one specific argument worth addressing: criminal backgrounds. According to Sowell, criminal backgrounds may be the reason that black people are discriminated against. Employers run the very real risk of hiring former criminals who are less reliable and even dangerous. This is classic discrimination 1. It's just the reality. Because black people are statistically more likely to be criminals, they are hired less. Where the nature of work made criminal background checks worth the cost for all employees, it was no longer necessary to use group information to assess whether individual young black job applicants had a criminal background. This made young black job applicants without a criminal background more employable than before. I'm going to have to discuss crime one day, aren't I? But not today. Today, we check the source. That's really unpleasant. The key paper Sowell cites shows that companies that engage in criminal background checks actually hire more African Americans. They are able to eliminate the main risk associated with hiring criminals. Therefore, they are not engaging in discrimination for no reason, and allowing criminal background checks is an easy way to eliminate that discrimination. Yet many hiring laws forbid checking for criminal backgrounds, backfiring against black applicants who are now less likely to be hired. Clearly, criminal records have some explanatory power. One problem is that this study is nowhere near as well designed as the CV studies. It is only correlational, and in the paper, the authors acknowledge that the difference disappears when they control for numerous heterogeneities in the companies. Notably, when company and industry size are included, there is no difference in the hiring of black people between companies that carry out criminal background checks and those that don't. My own interpretation of this study is that maybe companies that do criminal background checks are just bigger, and maybe bigger companies hire more African Americans, likely because bigger companies are more likely to have HR and PR considerations when compared to small companies. Maybe. I don't know. The study just isn't good enough to hinge the whole case about criminal background checks on. A better study comes from the Bertrand and Dufflo review, which is kind of similar to the CV studies. They had actual real people go out and apply for jobs, but some had a criminal record while others didn't, and some were white while others were black. Criminal records negatively impacted white people just as they did black people, though the effect was larger for the latter. Furthermore, a black applicant without a criminal record was about as likely to receive a callback as a white applicant with a criminal record. Again, the reality of discrimination outweighs other confounding variables. Before it was education, now it's criminal records. This kind of study is more flawed than the CV studies because of the difficulty of controlling actual human interactions like in-person interviews. But it's better than the one Sowell cites, and it contradicts him. A final and important argument Sowell makes is that markets and capitalism force even those with prejudice to accept those that they consider inferior as employees, customers, and tenants. He notes a few historical case studies, most notably when South African businesses broke the law during apartheid to hire black workers, simply because despite their race, they needed them. In contrast, many government-run organisations were the most discriminatory in their hiring, having not properly faced the costs of that discrimination in the market. Again, a point worth making. I'm not here to defend government discrimination. Maybe in some cases, market competition works against discrimination. As usual, I don't really have a dog in this government versus market fight. Both can suck in their own beautiful ways. What I am sure of is that this leads us back to the death of Economics 101. Sowell is pushing a model of competition where discrimination that is irrational, or type 2, costs employers in terms of workers and customers. Market competition should gradually weed it out. Yet, as economist Jennifer Doliak notes in her review of Discrimination and Disparities, this is a dated view. Like the classic demand-supply analysis of the minimum wage or immigration, it leaves out too much of the real world to make sense. Even small changes to this model of the world show how discrimination can persist.
Adding search costs to models of the hiring process can also produce persistent disparities in employment and wages. If even a few biased employers exist, and it is costly to search for better opportunities, then black job seekers will have lower reservation wages, leading them to accept lower offers.
She also echoes the point that Dubois, and more importantly Downton Abbey, made about feedback between discrimination and the traits of those discriminated against.
Even small amounts of discrimination can result in racial segregation of housing and employment, with corresponding effects on networks. Individuals whose networks are relatively disadvantaged can be thought of as having less social capital, an important form of human capital. They will find it difficult to improve their economic outcomes.
Doliak draws attention to numerous case studies where government intervention has helped and questions Sowell's use of evidence in this area. But I am less concerned with policy here than with establishing the fact of discrimination. My bottom line is that the CV studies show that discrimination has persisted in the private sector as well as the public sector. This is a fact to be explained, and Sowell cannot. Can anyone engage with these studies? Bueller? UK pundit Andrew Doyle appeared on Alex O'Connor's podcast. When Alex raised these studies, Doyle highlighted evidence that recruiters are more likely to hire people with the same birthdays as them.
The stronger evidence for that, or the stronger explanation for that, is that people tend to favour candidates who are more similar to themselves, to the extent that if an applicant comes in with the same birthday, you are more likely to favour that applicant.
So the CV studies are less evidence of racism and more evidence of a general tendency of humans to stick with their in-group, just like football fans or rival departments within a workplace. Let's think this through though. People are more likely to hire those with the same birthday as them. That's because birthdays are of cultural significance in many Western societies. Yet Quakers and Jehovah's Witnesses abstain. Many countries across the world are likewise less likely to celebrate birthdays than we are, including Vietnam, Bhutan, Mozambique and Japan. If you did the CV studies in these populations, you likely wouldn't find employers hiring people with the same birthday because people care less about birthdays in the first place. For what it's worth, I couldn't even find the birthday study Doyle was alluding to, much less one done in Mozambique to compare. This raises the question of why exactly race is deemed so important a marker of similarity in our society. Is the aim not to make it as insignificant as birthdays are for the Bhutanese? As the economist Bill Spriggs put it, why would anyone
assume that an entire set of actors observing the infinite diversity of human beings all settle on race as a meaningful marker independent of history, laws, and social norms? And, miraculously, only negative attributes highly correlated with race.
Race being a cultural signifier of inferiority is not just a simple in-group bias. It is the essence of racial prejudice. There is no reason, except the history of racism itself, to group people this way. Sowell knows that race is not a genetic fact. If you think he's on that train, you're wrong. He wrote a pretty good critique of the bell curve, although he does always try to blame progressives for eugenics.
They drew the conclusion from their reasoning that you had to put an end to certain races because they had what they call eugenics, but what was later called genocide. And so that idea originated with the progressives.
So why use such an arbitrary marker? I just don't think Sowell has a good reason for why employers or shops or landlords or banks seem to group people into the category black and further assume that this group is inferior on one or more dimensions. In Discrimination and Disparities, he blames the immigration of black people from the South for a rise in prejudice and discrimination against black people in general. Again, this doesn't follow without a historical reason to lump all black people in together. Sowell's unwillingness to interrogate the categories we take for granted extends beyond just race.
Mexican isn't offensive.
Well, it has certain connotations.
Like what?
Like, I don't know.
Well, what connotations, Michael?
No.
It must have meant something.
No.
Jennifer Doliak has reflected that Sowell also fails to delve into why employers would discriminate against those with criminal records.
The key question for those trying to design effective policies is why employers are discriminating against applicants with criminal records in the first place. Is it that employers view a criminal record as a negative signal about other characteristics they care about but cannot observe? Traits like honesty, reliability, interpersonal skills, or the likelihood of committing a crime on the job? If a criminal record is correlated with these underlying traits, then this would be discrimination 1 in Sowell's framework, statistical discrimination in common economic parlance, if employers simply do not want to associate with people who have broken the law and there is nothing you could tell them about the person in question that would change their mind. That is, they care about the criminal record itself, not as a proxy for something else, then this is discrimination 2 in Sowell's framework, and taste-based discrimination, or animus, in economic terms.
Sowell's pedantry and personal clarity give the appearance of academic rigour, but he is taking too much for granted while omitting the best academic research and practices. Academic rigour means not taking common sense ideas for granted, but unpacking them. It means designing studies to properly test hypotheses instead of hinting at doing so. It means engaging with the plethora of work that does all this and more. What's ironic is that Du Bois' essay is like an answer to Thomas Sowell, written over a century before him. If I were to recommend one thing to read after watching this video, The Philadelphia Negro would be it. There are long stretches on how the black community needs to lift itself up, and how eliminating prejudice and intolerance is not enough when African Americans have to make efforts to improve their own lot. Du Bois talks about work ethic, chastity, virtues like honesty and self-respect. He rails against crime in black neighborhoods. The difference is that this is all set clearly in the context of the mass discrimination faced by that community.
Men have a right to object to a race so poor and ignorant and inefficient as the mass of the Negroes. But if their policy in the past is parent of much of this condition, and if today by shutting black boys and girls out of most avenues of decent employment they are increasing pauperism and vice, then they must hold themselves largely responsible for the deplorable results.
Sowell just doesn't really acknowledge this. He pays lip service to it, but the majority of his work, which remember is supposed to be purely analytical, is playing down discrimination as an explanation for disparities. I don't know, maybe his general attitude has something to do with his New York upbringing. You want discrimination and disparities? I'll show you fucking discrimination and disparities! Perhaps it's time to wrap up. One limitation of Sowell's economics is that it's quite US-centric. Most of his examples are from the USA, and he doesn't seem to truly reflect on how different economics may be in different countries. This is an evidence from his treatment of Europe as a country, and what I'd see as his failure to provide a distinct analysis of poorer economies, which I went into in part 1. It's evident in his extremely biased treatment of immigrants from poorer countries. Sowell is certainly not into decolonizing economics, a term I'm sure he'd adore. Even worse than this, his books feature extended baseball examples, even though it's the worst sport known to man and is only really played by Americans. No, I don't know what a candidate is.
Face it, Fry. Baseball was as boring as Mom and apple pie. That's why they jazzed it up.
Boring? Baseball wasn't... So they finally jazzed it up.
If you're wondering if I'm going to rant about how bad America is, then I don't blame you. The video does seem to be going that way, with the ridiculous impressions, numerous jabs, and general critique of American society. Here's the thing. I believe in America. Okay, let me qualify. A YouTuber that I think I should get compared to but don't, probably because he's better, is BritMonkey. His videos are always compelling and well made, relatively well sourced, and he just seems to write about whatever takes his fancy. My philosophy is similar. Although I stay within economics, I cover everything from the gender pay gap to planned obsolescence to theories of value. Most economists aren't arrogant, well, worldly enough to do that. One of BritMonkey's recent videos is called America Could Be a Utopia. In this, he discusses how many advantages America seems to have. America has cutting-edge tech, extremely favourable geography, a massive economy, far-reaching culture, and is liberal democratic despite everything. Other potential competitors like Europe, there it is again, and China fail on at least some of these metrics.
The United States is the only country in the world with all of the following: perfect geography, a varied landscape, a location making it impossible to be successfully invaded, a resilient, self-sufficient economy, entrepreneurial spirit, technological superiority, a guarantee of civil liberties, a stable population, a welcoming immigration system, and a society that strives, more than others, for racial equality.
It's easy to sneer at this, and I saw a lot of leftists and Europeans being smug and dismissive and angry that someone would dare to defend the imperialist dogs, including on BritMonkey's own subreddit. Which, look, I get it. I'm still a leftist and British. I insult America at every possible opportunity.
When I'm with her, I'm reminded of the virtues of the English.
But isn't she American?
Exactly.
It's also possible to do a UE here. BritMonkey does cite credible sources, but he usually does it in passing with a graph flashing up on the screen that he doesn't really explain nor critically engage with. For instance, take this part about disposable income being higher in America.
The average American household has $60,000 of disposable income, the highest in the world, and that's after tax and social security and health insurance premiums.
Let's check the source then. What? I rehabilitated. His source is the OECD website, although I'm guessing this was via Wikipedia. He's right about the average. What's weird is that he doesn't go with median disposable income when the USA is known for its high level of inequality. Remember all that stuff we talked about in the first section of the video? Median disposable income is also on Wikipedia. The number falls 20%. The USA still does very well, but it's no longer top and it's closer to other countries.
It is entirely possible for a 16-year-old working at a grocery store in Oklahoma to make as much per month as the average Belgian.
Again, cherry-picking an advert with a starting salary of $18.87 an hour for a waiter when the median is $15.36, almost 20% less once more, is pretty sus. The overall median is probably higher than the median starting salary too. It's just true that the poor in America have it pretty bad, and BritMonkey kind of acknowledges this.
Don't be mistaken, I would rather live in Milan over Miami.
If I really wanted to, I could try and death by 1,000 cuts his video. This Redditor attitude, though, is not a good way to approach video essays, nor any creation, film, book, play, song, painting, or academic article. You need to think about it beyond knee-jerk reactions and pedantry. Although I may appear pedantic on my channel, I try to focus on central points rather than ancillary ones. And understanding central points typically requires extending charity and asking, how can I make this creation make sense? Typically, the essayist has put a lot of thought into the topic, probably more than you, half watching while playing Elden Ring. Be humble, sit down. This is why, despite my disagreements with Sowell, I've devoted a lot of time and space to understanding his arguments. Maybe too much? Let's not think about that now. By the way, this is the accepted approach to studying historical thinkers in economics. Make them make sense. As a historian of thought, Sowell knows that. Anyway, what is BritMonkey getting at in his video? He's not saying America is perfect.
Americans lag behind their European counterparts in terms of life expectancy, crime rates, and child mortality.
He's not defending everything America has done and will do. And yes, we can nitpick the sources, but the USA's economy has really pulled ahead. It's just undeniable. The salary for academic jobs in the USA was almost enough to make me want to go to the land of stupid people, school shootings and racism. Guess I do respond to incentives or whatever. Economics. Putting aside a few of his sillier points, the truth in what BritMonkey is saying is that America has potential. More potential than anywhere else in the world. The could in his title is important.
This video is about how the United States of America currently has all the building blocks required for that second Garden of Eden. They have been dealt a hand of aces that none of their competitors can match.
Even solely based on geopolitics, I think this might be true. From the abundance of land, extremely favourable transportation routes, lack of nearby enemies, and variety of terrain, the USA has never struggled with famine or invasion, whereas most countries have experienced at least one of those things in living memory. It goes beyond just the geopolitics, though. After his disastrous debate with Trump, but before he dropped out of the race to make way for Kamala Harris, Joe Biden gave a pretty good speech that, against my will, had an impact on me. In it, he said this.
We're the only nation in the world built on an idea. All the nations built on ethnicity, geography, and other religion. But we're built on an idea that we're all created equal. We deserve to be treated equally throughout our lives.
When I first listened to this, I was like, stupid American. Wait a minute. He's right. Now, it is a political campaign speech, so it's both simplified and exaggerated. There are obvious overtones of American exceptionalism here, and this is why Americans are annoying. Biden has said this before, and in response, a nice blog called Dorf on Law pointed out that the USA isn't only defined based on ideas, but
Also by land and ethnicity. That's what Manifest Destiny was. Arguably, many of the country's key challenges stem from these ethnic and geographic dimensions clashing with the ideal of the American dream. France, with its own revolution, is also arguably based on ideas. So let's not take Biden too literally. The US is not only defined by ideas, and it is not the only country defined by ideas. I'd still say that he has a point. The American dream is something to strive for. Being from a country where we stopped striving for anything a long time ago and just settled, BritMonkey also has a great video on this, by the way, just watch his channel instead of mine, I find this pretty compelling. In the UK, we love comparing our socialised healthcare favourably to the USA, and I stand by their system over theirs. Just recently I had some bad family news and I cannot describe how helpful and effective the healthcare system was without any of us ever having to consider money. But we only got a comprehensive welfare state and socialised healthcare after 2 world wars, about 1 millennium into our history if you start from William the Conqueror, which you should. America is still young. Sowell might agree with some of this. In Wealth, Poverty and Politics, he writes chapter after chapter about how favourable geographic and cultural and political factors have resulted in wealth in the USA and other rich countries. It's worth highlighting that descriptively, he's right that these factors explain how different countries have developed. But this leads us to the main problem with Sowell.
If you start just with geographic things, geography is not even. The rivers of the world are not equally usable by human beings. I'll give you one example. The Zaire River, which starts in Central Africa and goes great distances to the ocean, it has more water than the Mississippi. But it's not as valuable as the Mississippi because it has all sorts of waterfalls, cascades, and so on.
He is unable to distinguish between the descriptive and the normative. He thinks that by describing reality, you are justifying it.
I'm not tough. Life is tough. I'm merely trying to acquaint you with those facts.
Sowell's vision of the American dream is the following. You can make it if and only if you work hard in a paid job. Nobody should have to give you handouts. Any support should come from family, charity and religion, and if those institutions are failing, it's a cultural problem. When you're young, you may well have to eat shit, but when you're older, you may well be on top. Those who are on top should not be targeted because that will result in less wealth for everyone else, but you're not allowed to call this trickle-down economics. If you manage to migrate, or even if your parents migrated or grandparents, you should be grateful that you're in the country at all. If you're at the receiving end of discrimination, then tough luck. That's just human nature, and it's likely you're just not good enough anyway and are using discrimination as an excuse. If you advocate for change, you're naive and ignorant and don't understand basic economics. What's also true is that Sowell has lived this vision. Born in the Jim Crow South, his life looked like it would be a violent struggle just to exist until he was plucked out of poverty because of his ability, hard work, and a little luck. In an era of explicit institutional racism, he became one of the few African-American economics professors largely of his own merit. And I've got a lot of respect for Sowell for going through all of that. I'd even have respect for what he's achieved if he'd been born relatively privileged. I just don't think his experience is a roadmap, even if he does.
The American dream is alive for those unversed in the ideology of victimhood.
Contrast Sowell's vision with this quote.
The tenets of American democracy are particularly cherished when you are not born to them, but with deliberation and conviction adopt them for your own.
Or the quote from Urshid Manji in the Wall Street Journal article that Sowell conveniently ignored.
A common aspiration such as the American dream is crucial to giving Muslims a sense of belonging to something larger and more dynamic than cultural enclaves.
Insofar as I believe in the American dream, my vision is more like this. America is a place with enormous amounts of wealth, both natural and man-made. It is a place built, at least partly, on an ideal that is worth striving for, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In addition, it is a place which was long a refuge for people across the world, the huddled masses. If people need to work their way out of poverty, why not let people earn a multiple more just by moving country? This is why I'm sympathetic to calls for 1 billion Americans. Because apart from anything else, Sowell's discussion of immigration entirely omits the massive benefits to the immigrants themselves. Let's not deny the problems. From the original sins that still plague the USA to its contemporary dysfunctions, drastic change is needed. Sticking merely to the economic realm, comprehensive redistribution, reductions in inequality via other means, federal standards for wages, housing and healthcare, reparations, stricter regulation are just some of the moderate changes that could improve things for the average person and for the downtrodden. Of course, nothing about this has to be confined within the borders of the current United States of America. It's a set of principles, and many other countries also have enough wealth to take care of their population. I'd also be happy with 1 billion Europeans. Maybe in the UK, we could even begin to strive for something. Sorry, I can't keep a straight face while saying that. America has never lived up to the ideal, and it doesn't now.
All right, men, here's the order of deportations. First, you'll be rounding up your tired, then you're poor, then your huddled masses yearning to breathe free.
Breathers. Got it.
If you can rescue the American dream, it's by using the substantial assets of the country along with the ideal of America to call for drastic change. Du Bois was doing just that. Biden acknowledged the same.
We've never fully lived up, and I'll be damned in the year 2024, just 2 years. Just 2 years before the 250th anniversary of our Declaration of Independence, that I'll let Donald Trump walk away from it.
Brit Monkey also knows this. In response to the hate generated by his verse video, he followed up with a video about how, in practice, America is failing to live up to its potential because Americans are stupid and ignorant. What I'm saying is that if the American dream is worth rescuing, if it is worth rescuing, someone like Thomas Sowell is the worst place to go. Whether he's playing down the idea that inequality is high.
Piketty has said, these top people, his top 10% he used as an example. They have such disproportionate influence and so forth. They sit atop society and all of that. And if you get into the statistics, you discover that 53% of American households are going to be in the top 10% at some point or other in their lives.
Or playing down racial discrimination.
Those who have promoted the prevailing social vision in which lags, gaps, or disparities to the detriment of black people are the fault of white people are trapped in the corollary that these lags, gaps, or disparities should disappear once those other people are constrained by civil rights laws and policies. But nothing of the sort has happened.
Or chastising people for criticizing the rich.
And I didn't sit there thinking about how somebody else, somewhere else, was eating in more opulent places, more high-toned meals, and so on. I was glad to have that Canadian orange soda.
Or claiming that poverty is a good motivator.
Some politician said he wanted to sort of ease the pain of people in poverty. And he said, actually, the pain of poverty is what got many people out of poverty.
Or being exasperated at the suggestion that governments can help all this.
What do we make overall of government attempts to boost economic growth, get people out of poverty, promote education, if you look at the whole sweep of the 20th century?
Good heavens.
Or even being weirdly apologetic about Trump's wall?
Building the wall, is that in and of itself something of which we should be suspicious, that he wants to wall off the United States from the kind of, that he wants us to become more isolated? He wants to limit?
No, I don't.
Okay.
No.
Or is that unfair to Donald Trump?
I haven't given a lot of thought about being fair to Donald Trump. If we're in touch with 99% of the human race, the fact that we're not in touch with a handful of people relative to the world's population who are trying to come across the southern border doesn't make us isolated.
It's clear that Sowell wants to defend American society as it is from anyone who would criticize it and call for change.
And that was improved not as a result of a lot of noise, demonstrations in the streets, great pronouncements from eloquent speakers, but by the ordinary market processes that have gone on for years.
Aside from his questionable relationship to economics, and I mean actual economics, he wants the USA to stagnate or go backwards. Sowell's analysis will permit individuals to change their situation, but they're not allowed to change the situation itself. The rules of the game are what they are. They're not even rules. They're just reality.
I'm not tough. Life is tough.
This is the reality that we can change. My God, am I going to be called a liberal for this? Fuck it. Everything's bad and getting worse. There's no hope for America, and an increasingly volatile series of disasters will kill us all. Is that what you wanted? That would be a pretty funny place to end the video, but instead I'm going to quote my patron Robert H., who gave an inspiring and poetic capstone to avoid my original irony-tinged ending. A poem as we sign off. This is now a Zoe B video. Don't give in to Sowell's point that there's no difference between what is and what is possible. Who fought to change that? Haymarket rioters, unionised steelworkers, trust busters, shirtwaist suffragettes, freedom fighters, New Dealers, the civil rights movement, and new left progressives spent decades fighting for the rights and dignities Americans still have today. The New Deal and the Great Society now wane, but their legacy endures, and a yearning for progress still beats in the hearts of Americans. Think of what the American dream could be. Revitalized factories, union representation, labor protections, progressive taxation, working government, hope in tomorrow. We Americans have fought the worst robber barons and revanchists through depressions, world wars, and market collapses. There is still hope, unity, dignity, and promise in American politics. There is light that stands against the darkness. Don't let pessimism blind you to it. So I'll just say thank you to all of my patrons, and thank you to everybody watching. Thank you to Hobby for directing. Thank you to Ben and my editors. Thank you to everybody who has provided quotes. And it won't be obvious, but I am actually recording this on November the 6th. And yeah, we already know that Trump has won. So it's kind of coincidental what this video is about, but I suppose it takes on extra relevance now because, yeah, although I don't live in America, and despite the result, I remain defiant. See you in part 3.